Good afternoon, beautiful people. Welcome to another episode of Kiko's Freethinkers Forum. This is episode 105, and we're joined by a very special guest, a friend of mine now, a friend of the YouTube channel, Kiko's Freethinkers Forum. His name is Dr. Matthew Witt, and he is based in California, Laverne, California. He's a professor of public administration at the University of Laverne, and he's been on several episodes previously. Matthew T. Witt. The first time around we talked, we discussed his contribution in a series that talked about the Ukraine Russia situation back in 2014, entitled Flashpoint in Ukraine. We discussed his essay and his contribution within 20 different authors in that book that was published in 2014. Amongst those authors are Jack Rasmus, who's been on the show several times. Cynthia McKinney's also been on the show, and other people as well with that book. But Matthew Witt is pretty much a regular at this point on Kiko's Freethinkers Forum. My audience knows him well, and we just want to say welcome back to the show and thanks for coming back on.
Always a pleasure, Kiko. Thank you so much.
Yes, just a very slight ad. Won't take long at all. We have gotten a few donations recently. We appreciate that. We don't really urge people to send the donations, but people will probably say, Kiko, you going to tell them not to send your money? I'm not going to say no to the money, okay? But the biggest thing you can do for the forum is honestly, is to share the videos, like, and encourage the people that you know to subscribe for free. It doesn't cost you a dime, just a little bit of your time to expand your mind. You can't unthink free thought. That's kind of the slogan we use. We really don't want any of your money, honestly. I appreciate it, but it's more so getting this channel growing. We have a very ambitious goal to reach 20,000 subscribers by the end of 2024. I think it's possible. I'm glad to just have the subscriber base that I have. We have quite an international community. 43% of people that follow this YouTube channel reside outside the United States. Substantial amount of people, a lot of globalist perspectives, international point of views. But here we believe that you have to have local, national, and global perspectives and kind of understand them all together, which is a hard thing to do. But that's why learning is the way to go. You never stop learning, and that's kind of the way we like to approach information here on the forum, bring on different perspectives. We don't really have a particular ideological angle. I have my own views, but a lot of the times the guests that come on the show have very different views than myself, and we discuss those things. We talk about a lot of different issues on here. This is not just a political channel. We talk about a lot of cultural issues as well. And so some people don't like the political content, that's fine. If you like the culture content, that's great. You know, people watch things for different reasons. But I will say this in conclusion, independent media is under threat. And we are truly an independent media channel. We love to share independent minds and free thinking minds. And consider helping us out by giving us a subscription for free, because it is truly an independent channel. We bring on every perspective that you can think of, and we try to get along with each other. We don't do a bunch of fighting. We don't do the clickbait stuff on here. If you're looking for that, you know, maybe other YouTube channels are there for you. But let's continue with this wonderful episode 105. I don't want to get my audience too much in the weeds with some of the content we're going to discuss today, but we're going to talk some the first 30 minutes or so to 45 minutes. We're going to continue where we left off with Matthew. I believe it's episode 97, where we talked about the Washington Monument competition from 2011. And we also discussed his dad's contributions as an architect, and just how that project came to fruition. We discussed that previously. We're going to talk about maybe some redactions that Matt has to discuss with us, as far as, like, you know, telling us what he needs to enlighten us about. I have something to share too with the story that he gave about his dad, Marvin Witt, about his encounter with a group of blacks in Oregon. I thought it was interesting, that story that he shared, because I thought of a story myself that I'm going to share later that deals with the Washington Monument, and that will also transition into Charles W. Mills, who will be saying for the last hour and a half, 2 hours, however long we end up discussing this. Charles W. Mills was a philosopher, Jamaican American philosopher, and and he discusses a lot of different issues. He was really famous for the racial contract. I believe it was published in 1997. And then subsequently, there was a series of essays called From Class to Race, Essays in White, Marxism and Black Radicalism. We're going to discuss that too. That was a very tough read. I told Dr. Witt off camera, so he may have to help me with that last work that I mentioned. But the racial contract, I can probably give a lot more commentary about, contributions to, make a lot more connections with. But we're going to get this conversation started and discuss where you wanted to kind of leave off from the previous episode about the Washington Monument. What were you telling me off camera that you want to share with the audience?
Thanks so much, Kiko. You mentioned my father. I want to give a shout out to your father, Jerry Soul Train Scruggs, and that he was number 100 of your interviews. And I believe you had a couple of them. I just got started with one of them, and it was really special, really interesting, really informative. I look forward to getting back to it. I wanted to issue some corrections from points I made regarding history of the mall. I would have read my article. Now it's almost 20 years old. I should have read it a little more closely before we talked last time, but these are minor corrections, but for the good of the order, your readers and scholars who would catch it, I'd like to raise that. First of all, you dialed in this utilization of the word palimpsest in the title of that article, and I want to give the correct attribution here on that. I believe this analogy to palimpsest is attributable to Christopher Shea in an article called "The Brawl on the Mall." But I cannot now confirm this because after multiple attempts, I cannot locate the article. But I'm pretty sure it's Christopher Shea, The Brawl on the Mall, where I first got the notion of the space as having these palimpsest properties. Secondly, Henry Merwin Schrady's death. He was the sculptor for the Ulysses S. Grant monument group. Again, after multiple attempts to confirm, all I could find was a vague claim that he died of exhaustion the year that the sculpture was completed. He died of exhaustion. I misstated that his death was from cancer. That actually happened to the sculptor, the architect, rather, of the Jefferson Memorial, John Russell Pope. So we got sculptors and we got architects in these cases. John Russell Pope died of stomach cancer after very shortly after that, a few years after the monument was completed. Why it's so difficult to find more on these two guys is curious. Perhaps I've not looked hard enough. I'm going to say a little bit more about that as we get going, about the personalities and a little bit what was going on there. And perhaps there's some connection to other history that I'm going to tie in a moment. So died of exhaustion is the curious, I think, even for the times, claim to make. It's very vague and ambiguous what it would mean to die from exhaustion. But there it is. Like Schrady, John Russell Pope's monument design was very controversial, as was in particular, not so much the design, but the siting of the Lincoln Memorial. We could go down the list to Maya Lin, of course, excoriating criticisms of her for the Vietnam Memorial, the controversies around the Washington Monument. I made this point early on in our discussion last time. This ground is some of the most contested ground, short of maybe Civil War battlefields in the whole country. You raised the point, was DC a southern city in my estimation? It's such an intriguing point. And I wanted to mention the author Constance Green, and who I cited in that article, my one article about the mall that is relevant here. But Constance Green wrote two books relevant Kiko, perhaps interest you and your listeners. One is Washington, A History of the Capital, 1800 to 1950. In my research, she was considered, sort of, the go-to historian for all things capital, national capital and history for us. And then another book published in 1962. The other was published in 1967. The title, you'll find this provocative, Kiko, The Secret City, A History of Race Relations in the nation's capital.
Mm-hmm.
The Secret City, A History of Race Relations in the nation's capital. That's published. Both of those are published by Princeton University Press. I'm sure they're at Library Loan somewhere near you. Moving on quickly, the Jefferson Memorial, I said, was 11 feet tall and 10,000 pounds of bronze. I had it half right. It's 19 feet tall, 10,000 pounds of bronze. The Lincoln Memorial Reflecting Pool, I said, was part of the original design. I think still it may have been. However, looking up, I discovered it was part of grounds development and completion that was undertaken across the mall from 1922 forward to the 1930s. So the extent to which it was considered part and parcel of the design Lincoln Memorial, I cannot prove or disprove, but wanted to bring that up. Vietnam Memorial was completed in 1983, not 1986. From the point of contest for the design, the invitation to proposals for the design to the completion was the shortest of all the major monuments on the mall, something like 3 years. That story is spectacular. Let's see, I think I got one more point, two more points quickly. The construction on the Washington Monument commenced in 1848, not 1840, as I earlier said, and originally was planned to be 600 feet tall on a massive Pantheon base. The picture can be obtained. We'll skip it. It rose, but it ended up rising by 1856. It was only 156 feet tall. The year earlier, Congress had appropriated, in 1855, Congress had appropriated $200,000 to offset private donations organized by the Washington National Monument Society, but then tabled the bill after discovering the Know Nothing Party had seized control of that society. It would be another 21 years before construction continued. The unadorned obelisk was capped by an actually pyramid-shaped cone top, completed December 6, 1884. The dedication ceremony for the completed obelisk, organized by the Freemasons, was held February 21st, 1885. Why the Freemasons is relevant. I forgot to mention in my geeking out over all things Washington Monument and National Mall and writing that article, preparing all of that, this. So I came across this book back when I was writing this, or I think someone had recommended this to me at some point. I don't think I found it in the usual course of guys like you and me digging stuff up. I think someone mentioned this to me. The Secret Architecture of Our Nation's Capital, the Masons and the Building of Washington, D.C. It's written by David Oveson, who I believe is Freemason himself. Why? So what? Who cares? There was an anti-Mason movement in this country, and I think, I knew some of this history many years ago, and it's now blurry, but I believe, it'd been building for years after the Revolution, and it came to a head in the late 1820s. I believe there was a murder associated with this that sparked the movement, and I'm reasonably certain it was more of the same. Revolutionary fervor. It was at this time a revolt against the elites and their secrecy under Freemason affiliation, their exclusive practices that virtually anyone who got into Congress had affiliation with the Freemasons. This was a violation of principle and credo, founding credo, for the likes of people who would be what Mills would call the herring folk, the white settlers, the disenfranchised whites. who came from indentured servitude and otherwise, and who would form at some point the Know Nothing Party. I'd have to look up when it got formed, but it was antebellum. And I believe it formed in the 1830s, if not sooner, earlier. And the Know Nothings here are affiliated with taking over control of what was a Freemason affiliation devoted to the Washington Monument. So the intrigue around the mall is intense. And so I get back to Schrade's death, the curious circumstances of death, difficult to locate. John Russell Pope, the attacks against him and his design commission were vicious. He succumbed to stomach cancer a few years after the monument was built, Jefferson Monument was built. There are more zodiac. There's more zodiac architecture and symbolism in Washington, D.C. Than any other major city in the world, according to Oveson. And maybe I'm going to restate that. I believe he meant to say any major capital in the world. The landscape is loaded with Freemason history, arcane symbolism, and so on. And the influence of the Masons on members of Congress, affiliations there go way back and through the continuous present in sort of derivative ways. The whole Skull and Bones Society has affiliations there. And so the secretive society stuff is part and parcel of the legacy of the Washington Mall. One of the architects, one of the planners, the Robert Mills, was a Freemason. And the Mills plan was from, I believe, 1847. The Mills plan was one of the first major plans to establish what was going to happen from the Capitol to the Washington Monument grounds, to actually have some program design for it. He was a Mason. I didn't know, my article makes no reference to that. I wasn't aware of it at the time, but reading Oveson, who is a very, very careful chronicler, he mentions this. Curious, though, that his book makes no mention of the sculptor of the Grant Memorial, a major memorial. No mention. There's some mention of John Russell Pope, but not much. There's no mention at all of the sculptor of Daniel Chester French of the Lincoln Memorial. It's curious, a book about the secret architecture of a nation's capital wouldn't mention these. So anyway, I throw that out there for what it's worth. Finally, the amendment to the Commemorative Works Act came up because this was a major catalyst to me writing the article about the mall, getting interested in it. And I believe, too, why it got published. So the amendment to the Commemorative Works Act was passed under George Bush Jr. In 2003, and it stipulated that the reserve would be closed to any further development. The reserve is the two major axes that we've talked about in the last interview. And peripheral precincts would be available based on their proximity to the main axes. The main axis would be the reserve, and the peripheral precincts, like we're now the Martin Luther King Memorial, the Roosevelt Memorial, the Korean Memorial, are all situated. All major monuments are in these peripheral precincts, very close to the center, but in these precincts. I had not used the term reserve. So that's a correction. Thank you for that. Maybe more than necessary, but I just wanted to put that out there while I'm thinking of it.
Yeah, no, you're totally fine.
I
was intrigued by just the slideshow presentation. I appreciated that, and I know the audience members appreciated that. I thought that was well coordinated on your part. I thought that was a smart idea, and it was a great way to kind of chronicle like just everything that was going on. It's always good to have a visual with the story when you're especially I didn't know much about the Washington Mall, honestly. You always hear about certain figures kind of emphasized, the White House, but it's like you never really get to see, you know, anything outside of that image there on Pennsylvania Avenue. But it was kind of
Yeah.
cool to see different sides of different approaches of the actual ground.
For those who really want to geek out, there's this, and there would have been no article that I could write that could connect dots that I wanted to connect without the contributors to this work. The Mall in Washington, it's a collection of essays, outstanding essays, and wonderful sort of color plates and tremendous historic detail. The people have got curious by our discussion so far, who want more, the Mall in Washington is a must read, and I'm sure still available. It is published now. It's Mall Washington History 1791 to 1991. And it was first published 1991, and then again 2002, Trustees of the National Gallery of Art, Washington. My highest praise for this, and it's fast. You want to get it's fascinating. It's lays it out, and so from what my father loved about architecture was, I remember asking him once, Dad, what got you into architecture as a young guy? And he thought about it, and I'm remembering an extract of his response. He said, well, I tried this and that, and it was interesting, but I wanted something that studied it all, put it all together, And I relate to that with my father. When I was a teenager, I was very into journalism, and to me, journalism put it all together. And I didn't go far with it. I changed my mind when I got to college, but I loved how he put that. It puts it all together. And these contributors here remind me of my father's perspective on architecture, design, and planning, in how they incorporate so much in the writing. So high praise for them. Anyway, there you go. Moving on. I think our next, I'll get in now back to where we left off and hasten to get through the presentation on the mall, what our design was, get to that, and then move on to Mills. I did want to say I don't want to lose track of your get about DC as this quizzical geography, and it couldn't really be claimed by one side or the other. And you're very astute in catching how what I tried to write pulled that out. That this was always contested ground in historically, and the perceived need to tussle with what Constance Green called the eye of the hurricane. That DC was the eye of the hurricane coming up antebellum and into the Civil War and thereafter, on the matter of race, on the matter of the legacy of slavery, on those issues. And here we have Mills too, who's very much in the eye of the hurricane on race himself, intellectual hurricane, the energy for which is very much driven by the Marxist presumptions about race, which is that it's epiphenomenal, that race as an attribute is after the fact, the fundamental distinction in social relations, which is between those with access to the means of the production and those who are trapped in wage slavery. Yeah, and that is the fundamental social relation that all other facets are reducible to for understanding historical materialism, so on. So putting that out there, how we get back to Mills, I'm going to pull up then and share with where we left off, because I just rounded up the major monuments. We finished with the Lincoln, and then I was kind of going to do a walkabout of the space and recoup some of these main points. So I will share that. Let me share a screen.
You should be able to share.
You bet. There it is. So you are seeing PowerPoint.
Mm-hmm.
Got it? You bet. I will go to the where we left off. We wrapped up Lincoln,
Mm-hmm.
and I told you I looked.
Slide
I think we
27,
should,
it was probably the last thing I remember.
let's do that. Um, this is turning around at the sort of level of entry with the Lincoln Memorial and turning around and looking at what you see. And I think may recall, as I spoke, I turned around and imagined the gaze of Lincoln staring through me, which everyone feels, this sort of 1,000-yard stare, sort of penetrating right through you. And anticipating where does it look, I sort of pick up his line and aside and direct my head that way. And my conclusion is it's right to the base of the Washington Monument. It's not to the side. It's not looking around it. It's not, sort of off, it is dead center base of the Washington Monument, to do with what we will, interpret as we will, consider as we will, for what it's worth. By way of comparison is Jefferson, who's I had the same impulse when I stood at Jefferson's 19-foot statue on a 6-foot pedestal, 10,000 pounds of bronze. Both sculptures are much bigger than life, as is Ulysses S. Grant himself. And in each instance, you're compelled to sort of look up and go, to sort of look up and follow around what they're looking at. That's obviously, I think, intended.
Mm-hmm.
And how many people, countless people, have done this is sort of, I wonder what he's looking at. And then you sort of piece it together. And what happens then is that these monuments become obviously part of something much bigger. They encompass the entire space. And through the gaze of the figures that are sculpted, we become incorporated into the space. We become incorporated with the pieces of history that they were a part of, tendentiously a part of, controversially part of, hypocritically a part. It's all there. And so I'm looking down, I'm seeing him looking at, and I'm thinking, what's he thinking? What is the thought that we could attribute to his sculpture through the continuous present in history and for always? What thought can we attribute to him now? We played with the idea last time that he's got one foot pitched up and the other down. He's got one hand like this and the other is open. Has he just sat down, or is he about to get up? And what would that mean? Why would the sculptor give us that ambiguous, denote his posture so ambiguously? We can put together all sorts of ideas, but the challenge intellectually is to situate those ideas in place in history. He's looking at the Washington Monument. It is 3/4 of a mile away. As you walk towards it here in a very rare moment, because what's under construction there then in 2011 when I was doing this was the World War II memorial. And so they had drained the reflecting pool, and you can walk right across it in a couple inches of water. I'm standing there taking a shot. Also under construction is all of us at any given moment in our lives. And I was struck by two guys walking my way and others who clearly wanted to walk. They could have walked the promenade, right, like you're supposed to. But like me, they're walking right down, almost down the middle of the reflecting pool. I wondered if they were thinking like me. We're all under construction here, and how are we supposed to? What's the invitation implicitly to think about that here? So this is a telephoto zoom. I'm kind of zooming in the Washington Monument here, walking a few paces past where I just was, but off to the left side. And beyond the monument is the nation's capital, right? And under construction here is what now is World War II Memorial. I love this shot, not for the outstanding photography, but for the rare moment that it offered to show them all under construction, and not a finished piece of art forever and always, or civic sort of plaza design and historic placemaking and all that, that contrary to the Commemorative Works Act, it is still under construction, and it ought to be considered forever under construction, it seemed to me. Then so we have to recover some of these ordinal points on the map and in our minds for how we think about these figures. We've got Lincoln sitting in repose of sorts, but ambiguously so. I present here by way of contrast with my association of Jefferson as an American Apollo. The architecture would denote is certainly Greco-Roman. It's based on a 3/4 scale, the Pantheon. That doesn't have to do with the Greek temple per se. The Pantheon is devoted to all ways of spiritual understanding, very ecumenical, very cosmopolitan, very Rome at its height. But I see in the Jefferson Memorial something related. I see a temple to an oracle. I see a design that would seem to denote Jefferson as oracle-like, and certainly his legacy, his countless biographies, his hagiography characterizes him as such. But then we have Lincoln. Jefferson was Apollonian in his way, his personal achievements, his devotions to cultural refinement, his reverence for all of what was the European endowment and legacy in the New World, so-called by them, and that seems fitting. I'd stand by that. But Lincoln is a much different creature. Lincoln is, and he's depicted very differently, whereas Jefferson is chest up and out and has got a scroll in his hand and, neatly dressed and looking up over the basin towards the White House. I'm reasonably certain, at least parallel, of not looking down forever on the Oval Office. Make of that what you will. I think in some ways it's unmistakable what inferences we could claim of it. There are historians that would do way better than I can for what might have been on the minds of people in the time that it was there. I could play around with that. But forever is another matter. How people revisit these figures is another matter. Lincoln here is in recline, very different from Jefferson, who was standing up. They could have sculpted him standing up, but they didn't. Why? And ambiguously so. He's seated as if he either just sat down or is about to get up. Now, that's a trick of sculpture to enliven a figure, that it's not inert. It enlivens, and that tension, that ambiguous tension is ingenious for, in this case, enlivening the figure. I think it's the most genius sculpture on the mall, for that matter. But to me, then there's something Dionysian about this. There's something tragic. There's a Greek god of tragedy for the Dionysus, the god of tragedy for the Greeks, the vigil of hubris. And this is taken from the East Pediment of the Parthenon, Athens, Greece. Romans would recharacterize Dionysus as Bacchus, the god of the harvest. And Bacchus is associated with reverie and with ceremony, seasonal ceremonies associated with harvest, and with and associated with the bounty of the harvest. Nothing terribly tragic there. The rewriting by the Romans doesn't do justice to the legacy the Greeks left the Romans with this tragic muse, this tragic sense, that which informed so much their literature and that's left us. And so I see in Lincoln and his place in American history as something much more tragic, that he observed in what he saw the great comeuppance of the country against the hypocrisy that Jefferson, in a sense, embodied. A nation that could hold these truths to be unassailable, that all men are created equal, while resurrecting what was an ancient institution, bonded slavery. By then, it was an ancient institution that resurrecting that. So this spectacular contradiction, this spectacular hypocrisy before the creed, we will talk about with Mills later. But in Lincoln, this is what I see. I see the recompense. I see the tragic awareness that we dare not be too proud of our past, and because the ruin of a single life is in the face of sort of overweening hubris, overweening pride, overweening sense of capability to fly too close to the sun, to venture too far, to whatever. What that does to ruin a life in the sort of ambit of tragedy can be mapped on entire nations. And for me, Lincoln is the vigil. He's the vigil of that. And others will have different, it's great. We can see it differently. But this is how I pulled together why a monument is missing on this ground.
Wow. That makes sense. I guess my question for you would be, out of would you say that that's your favorite, the Lincoln Memorial?
It's not my favorite memorial, but I think it is the most brilliant sculpture.
Okay.
So of the sculpture group in particular, I'm thinking, and I haven't made a close study of the Martin Luther King Memorial, the Roosevelt, or I've visited them. It's been many, many years, but I've not made a close study. But of these sort of original ordinal point primary reserve monuments that denote, right, this ordinal points in the mall, the Jefferson, the Grant, and the Lincoln. I think the Lincoln is the most ingenious. I think my second would be Ulysses S. Grant, definitely, and third would be Jefferson. But as it were, it is because of the ambiguous way his posture is denoted, and the portent of that for understanding his place in history and what may be going on with the sculpture. So,
and just to get confirmation for the audience, based on the act that was passed in 2003 under George H.W. Bush.
George W.
Bush, that's correct.
The junior, yeah.
You call him George Bush Jr. I think it's so funny. But W, G-U-B-A-A.
W.
As far as that act was concerned, the commemorative act that you talked about previously, does that mean that nothing else can be constructed within the mall? Like, is there a stop to the monuments? Like, how does that work out?
So, thank you. It means that in the reserve area, which is the primary axes, it's the north-south and the east-west that denote the sort of greensward from Ulysses S. Grant, that open greensward to the Washington Monument, and from there over the World War II, the reflecting pool to Lincoln. That's the east-west reserve. It's transected by the south-north reserve precinct area. Muddle their utilization of terminology. The reserve north is Jefferson looking to the White House. And the reasoning for the amendments to the Commemorative Works Act. The amendments were passed in 2003. Commemorative Works Act was authored 1986. The reasoning was very straightforwardly that the mall, this primary two axes of the mall, were largely completed work of civic art. That's a pretty close paraphrase to the actual basis for the bill in 1986. That the primary reserve of the mall is basically a completed work of civic art, and that any further work, therefore, in that reserve would compromise the work that was there. Congress believed that to place any more there threatened the integrity of what by then was the 1965 Skidmore Owens Merrill, I think, was a law firm, an enormous architectural firm, sorry, of the era. And they had been contracted for yet another rewrite of the mall design plan, master plan, that they finished in 1965 and was adopted by Congress in 1965. I give account of that in my article under the heading Towards Abstract Monumentality. Okay, so the Commemorative Works Act 1986 was intended to sort of recover the design attributions made of the mall by Skidmore, Owings, Merrill in 1965, and with this argument that got back to the Vietnam Memorial, which is that the enormous pressure that the popularity of the Vietnam Memorial placed on Congress had to do with everyone now associating the mall with being a space for more and more personal monuments. And so as I give account in my article, I think there was a push for a monument to Ronald Reagan, one to Thomas Paine, the list was going on and on. And I think this is a tribute to Maya Lin's design and to the collective wisdom it took to make that design, to actualize that design. That the popularity of that, I can't quantify it, but I know when I wrote this article that the Vietnam Memorial was by far the most popular monument on the mall. The People's Choice Monument was the Vietnam Memorial, and I'll give you a couple images here in a little bit. But the second most popular is the Lincoln after Maya Lin's. Okay, so they passed the 1986 Commemorative Works Act because of Maya Lin's design and the floodgates opening, the storming of the gates of prerogative over what was going to be denoted in that mall space. So again, to people not so interested, this is just geeking out between you and me. The people who can see some relevance here, I hope pertinent, that this ground is and should be, has always been and should continue to be contested. And what I proposed in the article was, look, you need to, for that matter, you need to keep this ground, this reserve has to be kept open to further interpretive work. I mean, after all, they put the World War II memorial in, I mean, that it's sort of like, obviously, there's no cardinal rules here. The World War II memorial went smack dab in the middle of these precincts, right in the virtually right at the intersection of the two main axes. It's just west of the intersection of the two main axes, and it's that ground that J. Carter Brown called sort of the most sacred space in the country, and he was chair of the Commission of Fine Arts. And major source, I believe, behind pulling this work together, an important source pulling this work together. And that's ground that I consider to be where another monument should go. The monument to civil rights really ought to be there. And I'm not dismissing the Martin Luther King Memorial at all, but to back up a little bit, I think a major reason why my article got rushed in, I don't know, rushed in, but it definitely got preferential treatment by the editorial staff of Public Administration Review because of the timing. I wrote it in 2004. It was up. It got published in September 2005. It was fairly well fast-tracked through the the review process, and one of the Camilla Stivers had said to me in correspondence, giving me praise for the work, saying, "I think this may be very important for people considering the siting of the Martin Luther King Memorial." that the timing of this is important, because that memorial had bid, the proponents for that memorial had bid for a space more central for Martin Luther King, appropriately, in my opinion. But they didn't win the debate with National Parks, I think, was the agency that they had to negotiate with, and Commission of Fine Arts. I don't know what its position would have been there. I have done no archival work on that, but the National Park Service has, I believe, predominant jurisdiction over the mall grounds. So my article was intended to say, look, this ground fundamentally has always been contested. It should never be sealed off, because doing so is oxymoronic and hypocritical and untrue to the history of this space. It lacks fidelity to the purposes attributed to this space for decades and decades and generations. It's a mistake. It's always been reinterpreted. It is a palimpsest. It is the nation's palimpsest. But certainly we have to be reasonable in how we consider the next monument proposed, because there's no limit to the imagination, and there hopefully is no limit to the history, and there should be no limit to prerogative for people to pitch ideas. However, there's responsibility in that, and it cuts two ways. It cuts from the standpoint of who would propose this or that monument on one hand, and those who would review that and vet that proposal against criteria that stay true to a couple of principles. And those I articulated as assimilating the Commemorative Works Act's concern, which is very valid, which is you can only accommodate so many monuments before it starts to look like a theme park. So therefore, there ought to be a couple of criteria for review, just two. One is every work that anyone wants in the primary reserve needs to incorporate the narrative that is already on this ground, a narrative that is there if you attempt to tease it out, as I do in my article, and as these wonderful historians of the mall planning and design did in their work well before I did. And on the one hand, and on the other hand, the monument design ought to preserve view corridors so that you don't raise something up and eclipse, and clearly the World War II Memorial does that. The World War II Memorial, it takes its cue from the Vietnam Memorial in that it's sort of low slung. It's horizontally oriented instead of vertically oriented, as should any monument that is in the eye line between others that would become eclipsed. So that was it. That's what I proposed in the article. And it was with that I said, here's an example. Here's an example of a monument that could fit in this space, in fact, quite centrally in this space, and in responsible ways that incorporates the full narrative of this context and respects the importance of preserving view corridors. So we're going to go there right now. And what I do is I try to size up these ordinal points that are there by way of, nailing down this narrative. And so the Washington Monument is, among other things, about origins. It's about beginnings that renew with each generation. It's a process that's never finished. The obelisk itself, I think of as kind of crystalline in a way. Yes, it's Egyptian in its sort of design. Yes, it's got strong affiliations with Mason iconography. We could get very esoteric, I'm sure, very quickly with knowledgeable people over the Masons and their architectural devotions and their esoterica, which is spectacular. We could also play with it as if for the first time that crystals have geometric structures to them, and crystals have all sorts of other connotations than does an opaque stone-based obelisk. but they share in common the geometry, and the geometry is forever. It is a form found in nature, curiously in nature, orthogonal points in nature. Everything we see on the surface of nature is, for the most part, curvilinear and polymorphous, but crystals are very geometric. So, this obelisk is crystalline. It emanates from an earthen mound, and in a sense, it emits in this emanation shock waves that go out from it, concentrically away from it, as it were. The Jefferson Memorial denotes refinement, ambition, clarity, purpose, reason, conviction. Its monument, for that matter, is Apollonian. It's evocative of the Greek values of discipline, of learning, of intellectual pursuit, among other things, and cultural refinement, and how the individual is inextricably part of cultural refinement, which is inextricably reciprocally part of the individual. The Greek city-state in its classic conception being the fullest and most essential actualization of what it was to be human. Very much an Apollonian enterprise. Lincoln, prosecution of justice, realignment of founding covenant, and tragic witness. His monument is, for that matter, in counterpoint to Jefferson, Dionysian. Ulysses S. Grant, and I get this from a dear friend passed recently, just a couple of years ago, Lance DeHaven Smith, described Ulysses. He was a Southerner, very much a Southerner, and a wonderful, wonderful guy, an outstanding intellectual, Lance DeHaven Smith. Lance is well known for his work on what he coined state crimes against democracy. It has a lot of symmetry and simpatico with Peter Dale Scott's much earlier work on the deep state, which is terminology I'm sure you're familiar with, and it's come up between you and me in previous discussions. So Lance DeHaven Smith, a close friend, a close colleague, worked closely with him for many years. He described to me Ulysses S. Grant as the ruthless redeemer. The ruthless redeemer. Monument is vigilant. It is the eye of the storm. And this evokes for me too Constance Green's conception of antebellum Washington, D.C. as the eye of the hurricane. And we have in Grant's memorial a hurricane-like composition, or swirling forces all around him, at the center of which is the high pressure zone, right, of the stable point, looking westward. The ears of the horse pricked, looking southward. I can imagine another take on that. Given the time that it was sculpted, one could think of it as subtle dog whistling racism. That the massive immigration that had started with boll weevil outbreak in around 1915, the massive, historically huge, singular in the nation's history and possibly in recorded world history by numbers, movement of people, was south to north in the U.S., continental U.S. And it may have been subtle dog whistling to say, hey, the Black people are coming. This is what we need to pay attention to. No one has said that to me, but I'm not going to dismiss that either. It occurred to me after we spoke that, here I've valorized in some ways these monuments, and I've given them the benefit of the doubt interpretation, and to a certain extent, in an attempt to ennoble this space, I'm not lionizing these figures by a long shot. I think that's clear. And I hope it'd be clear with when I get into what my father and I ginned up and worked on with for this competition. So, but anyway, there it is. Ruthless Redeemer, monument, vigilant, eye of the storm. There's other symbols. There's the White House. It's the seat of the people's representative, nominally. There's the Capitol building. It's a clearinghouse nominally of state testaments for the people's will and interest. Okay. It's just for what it's worth, Kiko. I appreciate you permitting me to sort of play with these ideas. So here's what we did. And this was the title of our submission to the contest. It revised. We had 2 rounds that we had the initial round, and there were hundreds of submissions. We made it to the semifinal round of 24. It was a huge honor. But there were hundreds of submissions for this. So from many voices, democracy in the key of peace, justice, and prosperity for all. It was submission number 0126, stage 2 semifinals. And I'm gonna go through this kind of quickly. We get to move on, but we had the challenge they gave us. The design challenge was very specific, and they spent a lot of time. This was George Washington University and the AIA, Architects Institute of America, who had sponsored this together. And it was controversial. National Park Service issued a statement saying these people can do whatever they want, because they knew how to get publicity. Is George Washington University and AIA. They knew how to get publicity, and they wanted to push this, and they did not like the Amendments to the Amendment Works Act. Clearly, this was a retort, and they had a publicity campaign that was pretty refined and sophisticated. And at some point, the National Park Service felt compelled to respond, and it was very testy, if not nasty. They said these people could do whatever they want. Nothing about it is official. They have no commission. They have no authority. They have nothing. It was very nasty and sort of unsure. It was, and they didn't claim they had a commission. They didn't claim there's any act of Congress to sponsor this. It was nothing like that. This is a design competition. An national ideas competition to open up dialogue discussion. Okay, good on them. You can imagine the thrill for me when I heard this from the librarian I mentioned. Its name is escaping me. It'll come back to me. Donna Bentley was this wonderful chief librarian at University of Laverne for all the years I was there and many years before. And how she kept track of what I did and then brought up this thing that came over her desk was spectacular. I never would have known of this without Donna Bentley. And so, but the challenges were, what are the visionary ideas on the mall already? How will we interpret the Great Cross Axis? What is the symbolic relevance of the Great Obelisk? How do we assimilate the major symbolism present on the mall already? How are we going to maintain view corridors and open space and address public use? Much of this is what I actually tried to write about in my article. This design competition was startling for how congruent it was with what I tried to say in my article. So again, I'm sort of pinching myself. Wow, hey, some people read this. I imagine. Almost certainly they did read it. Almost certainly they were familiar with this, and they were familiar with a whole lot more about the history of the mall and the content. Absolutely. This is George Washington University, after all, and their affiliation with the AIA Virginia chapter or DC chapter. So, as it were, visionary ideas from many one across 3 gradients, east, west, south, north, subterranean to the surface. Interpretation of the Great Cross Axis, there's a call and response. And as with as it were, slave the songs of the field among slaves, the call and response, songs that were encrypted to escape the master's discernment, to slacken the work effort when they could, and it sounded like singing to the foreman, but it was actually had informational content to let other slaves know, if you're taking a break, the foreman's coming. Call and response. And that motif struck me as relevant in some ways here on this ground. Addressing the symbolic relevance of the great obelisk, its origins and eminence. It emanates a kind of vibration that gathers across this space and materializes in built structures at these ordinal points. Assimilation of major symbolism, reverberation, gathering and regathering of this narrative content and the potency of it, and synthesizing that and playing it back always to the middle. And the middle plays it back to the ordinal points. And the ordinal points gather it back in the middle. And there's this constant back and forth that has to be understood about this space. That's why the view corridors are important. It's what makes this space super, it needs to be understood. And it means that the space in between is very important. I spoke last time about the Vietnam Memorial, and part of its genius is that it directs the viewer always away, the visitor always away from the monument itself. It does it with the black granite, which is highly reflective, and you see yourself in it. You look past the names that are inscribed and you see yourself. It's beautiful. And then the vertex orientation with the accentuated vanishing points that in particular emphasize everything that's away from it. It says there's something going on here between the monuments. It's super important and needs to be understood. Maintenance of view corridors and open spaces, so that the view corridors are connective tissues of negative spaces. The addressing public use, discovery, inspiration, instruction. This is a site plan. It doesn't say much. It's a very small scale. My father did based on the existing and what we were proposing for the Washington Monument design competition for what we had in mind. We had an initial, our original submission was much more modest and very much keyed to what you're familiar with from the article. And the article was, it had this, right, it had this amphitheater-like scarp into the ground in an arc, right? And it had a wall sort of cutting across that with a promenade in an arc. We assimilate some of that, but we add a whole bunch more here in this round two. So this is the monument. Here we have it in site plan. This is the whole plaza, 32 some acres, and this is it in cross section. So there's the Washington Monument in cross section. Here's the slope in grade. Here's the built structures we called for. We'll give you detail in just a moment and a perspective on that. And here in the site plan, you see these one is here and one is here. And then westward, we called for a reflecting pond of our own, and an amphitheater, literally an amphitheater for staging of all kind of public address or otherwise westward of it. So to get into more detail, what I showed there, that was this sort of on either side, east-west, we had, in keeping with the principle, you've got to go low. You don't go high. If you go high, you cut off view corridors. You got to go low, and you have to capture that iconic of the earth, something going on here. You know, I don't want to lose track of a reference I made back when, I don't remember, an earlier discussion than last time, even, I think, to Jamie Foxx's film, The Burial. And I want to put a pin in that and try to remember to come back to that motif that he was working with creatively in that film. So here we've got subterranean, goes down to the ground, and there's two of them. There's one to the east that looks to the Ulysses S. Grant Memorial eastward, and there's one to the west that looks to Lincoln. Call and response, reverberate, send the shock wave of the origin of the country with the crystal shoved out of the earth and sending these waves in all directions, comes back. Ulysses S. Grant looks westward, back to the monument. Lincoln looks, Jefferson cuts right across it. The White House is at another point of this. It's unmistakable, as with Charles Griswold, that the Civil War is foundational, as if by a guiding hand, to the inscriptions in this space. It's unmistakable, and understanding. And to people for whom that is foundational to the identity of the country in its spectacular contradictions, hypocrisies, and cruelties on the one hand, on the other hand, to its redemption. that this space would articulate that is important, and in weird ways, kind of wonderful. So then we had architecturally the challenge, what are we going to call these things? And I'm like, well, Dad, think about, the eastward sort of pavilion here is looking east. It's looking towards the past in a sense. It's looking towards the capital. It's looking towards Ulysses S. Grant, which is very literally the past, the Civil War, but itself, which looks forward back. And so what is appropriate here? And I said, well, this is a place of the contemplation of the dark. It's a contemplation of that which has been sublimated. It's a contemplation and consecration of that which has been buried in consciousness. To get to Charles Mills and the epistemology of racism, it is that which is subterranean in some literal ways, in sort of lost grave sites, slave grave sites. And plowed over. And to say nothing of the tribal people here first. And I'm putting a pin in that one to round back. It's all of that and more. And so I said, well, so I just went to the dictionary. I said, what dark, other pertaining to, right? You want to find as dictionary definitions tend to get to other pertaining to. So I've just, other pertaining to darkness. What do we got? Well, Stygian. The river Styx. And so it was based on that. There was this sort of affiliation with the river Styx. And I said, let's call it the Stignarium. And so Stignarium is the place of darkness. And like a room of darkness. Then the forward of that would be, okay, what do we got going forward? Well, this is going to be a place of contemplation for all of that. And then going forward is going to need to be something else. So perspective view Stignarium looking west-northwest towards visitor screening facility. This is a visitor screening facility. The obelisk, by the way, has an elevator. So that you can ride up to a balcony, as it were, cut into the very top where it turns into the pyramid. And I think it's mostly out of commission. But they did ask for some recovery of that functionality. And I said in somewhere, this is important. This is the circulatory properties of a crystal. It's always growing. It's emanating from the ground. And so that it has circulatory properties important. The glass, the crystalline, to denote the crystalline properties, to capture the crystalline properties that we're making association with here this is a glass covering with an aperture in the top to let sun come in and thoughts go out. And we have here it's squared off in design, and in the one forward it's circular in design, and there's a reason for that. And if I can remember, I'll get back to it. This is as it were a cross section and site plan in more detail. So here's the Stignarium eastward. This is westward Prometarium. So prometera is to move forward, to go forth, to promenade, to go forth. So in the Stignarium, we had programming for consideration of the nation's past. It was a particular emphasis on gathering space, speaking space, presentation room, and continuously sort of standing and invited exhibits of historic figures in literature, in public affairs, everyone from Frederick Douglass to Ralph Ellison to Maya Angelou and so on, who would be maybe some permanent sort of features, and then visiting exhibits to be in this sort of this circular promenade here. And then the interior space would be gathering for presentation, like a classroom, would be fully outfitted for those purposes. That's the Stignarium. The Prometarium then would be a concession space for food and drink and so on. And also a feature we wanted was an interactive exhibit for people to upload their impressions of the mall. And would be continuously upgraded with technology where people just wanted to leave their handprint. They could scan their hand and it would be archived digitally forever. and there it was, and you get a ticket stamp that is yours, and that's you, that's wanted. It would have to be, there would have to be rules for profanity and whatever, fraternity hazing hijinks might be attracted to such an exhibit. But as it were, that one at a time, people are part of this. This is a living space. They want to say something. They want to commemorate something. And we're going to archive it digitally, and it could be recalled by them at home. It could be keyword searched and located. Why not? And then concession, food, so on, and a place from which to venture forth is captured by. Forward of that would be the pond here and the gathering space for, again, facing backward, reverberating backward, bringing the energy, the chi, the feng shui of this space always back to the center. It's back, regathering and emanating. And this is an amphitheater. And that's what amphitheaters do. So that's the westward terminus of our design proposal. Here is the remnant of our original design from the article, is this arcing path that very coincidentally, as it so happens, aligns with the Jefferson. It was a marker that Jefferson had laid for a corner point of Washington, D.C. in his original platting of it. And it's called the Jefferson Pier. And there's a little marker in the ground. It's nothing, man. It's just a little cement. It's a little cement, not even pedestal, that is sitting in the ground. It's called the Jefferson Pier. And why anyone cared? But coincidentally, I mean, remarkably, in our and really to scale where we locate this path, the curvature is just right to pick it up. And this path is the center point. This is the center point of the north-south axis. This literally picks up Jefferson's gaze southward 3/4 of a mile, picks it up and bends it as we had wished, as we gave account in the article, bends his vigil, otherwise a straight line, otherwise very Apollonian, but to conform to the long arc, the moral arc of the universe is long, but bends towards justice. This was the frequent evocation of Martin Luther King. And it picks up Jefferson and it refracts him towards the White House. And it faces Lincoln. And it incorporates the resonance of Lincoln. It responds to Lincoln. Lincoln doesn't look blankly to the bottom of the Washington Monument that gives not much back to him. It assimilates so much of what's happening here and says, your work wasn't half bad. It continues. We commemorate you with doing so. And that's in a broad terms what we were trying to capture. There was all sorts of other verbiage. There was a plaza ornamentation. We wanted mandalas that are sacred spaces of gathering and meditation and contemplation. And an art historian, good friend of mine at Laverne, joined this effort with his honors art history class and took on the task of pulling some design pitches and the basis for those. And so, for what it's worth, and then there's Native American designs that have attributes like this. The patchwork quilt symbolizes America's political, social, economic, cultural diversity coming together to form a unified whole. The patchwork quilt is a populist form that also carries association with American history. It evokes a survey lines drawn on the landscape at various times during the nation's history to divide up the country into the individual states and regions. Patchwork also brings to mind the Depression era, when a revival in the form resulted from the need to use materials economically. There's Mitless stonework here, Native American stonework. There is this mandala-like, concentric but center-oriented design motifs that are simpatico to the notion of mandala. woven basket and pattern work depicted also here. And to use this as ornamentation for these plazas, to try to assimilate my father's ambition, all of it. So to wrap up, this is an aerial view of the Washington Monument looking southeast. Here's the Jefferson Memorial. Here's the Potomac that winds around this space. I do not know the name of the island here or isthmus that this is on. Here's the Washington Monument, and this is again, we're looking southeast, right? So the Capitol building is this way, yeah. The Lincoln Memorial is this way. The White House is right there. The Jefferson Memorial is there. And so on the one hand, do the grounds still look so empty? So as I thought of it, right, I opened this presentation with the grounds look nominally empty around the Washington Monument, but are they? Was the rhetorical question, was the pitch that started this presentation that I gave years ago to Laverne, and that with your generosity we're redoing here. Do these grounds still look so empty now that we've considered the complex context within which they're situated, the contested ground, the ambiguous signification, given that the accommodations made to, in sort of scattershot ways, accommodations made to ambivalence over the nation's institutional affiliations, antebellum, and to get past that because we had to, we should, we ought, we had to, one way or the other. Your get on that, Constance Green get on this, and my attempt here to assimilate kindred sentiments about all of this. But is it actually empty? And as we open, the real voyage to discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. The greatest obstacle to discovery is not ignorance, it's the illusion that we know exactly what's going on. And then to Nietzsche, whoever looks into himself into a vast space and carries galaxies in himself also knows how irregular all galaxies are. They lead into the chaos and labyrinth of existence. I think that I don't know if Lincoln almost certainly could not have read Nietzsche because Nietzsche was just born in 1850. But I think he'd be very sympathetic to this. Lincoln was very fond of the Psalms. He read the Psalms. That was his favorite part of the Bible. And this is Psalm-like. This is from Nietzsche's aphorisms. And so it was myself, it was my ex-wife many years ago was involved in this to a certain extent. A graduate student, assistant of mine was involved. A close friend and artist of mine, Deanne Johnson, was involved. John Lever and Laverne honors art history students were involved. A friend of mine and my ex-wife's, David Freeman, was assisted in this, and the University of Laverne, where I was affiliated, in particular, College of Business Public Management, Arts and Science, College of Arts and Sciences, Arts Department, Honors College, Communications Department, University Advancement, the Wilson Library, Center for Teaching and Learning. I want to give credit where credit is due. They were all marvelous in helping pull this together, being supportive. The president was very supportive at the time, Dvor Lieberman, and all to say, it was a team effort. That's stop share there. There is I don't know how our time was, but there was the whole shoot match on what we tried to do, try to situate in the historic context, the narrative context, bring to you and your listeners the challenge established by George Washington University, Architects Institute of America, working closely together to consider ways in which this space that was designated a reserve by amendments to legislation in Congress still ought to be kept open, ought to be kept alive, ought to be kept interpretive, and not sealed off. And again, signifying another round of contentious sort of attributions and claims and prerogatives placed on this space that I think is ironically the most sacred civic space in the country, and for that matter, it's very liminal. As you connected with early Kiko, it is There's a whole lot going on. And to round off, the Masons clearly saw it that way. The Mason iconography, the platting of the city, I've discovered, was very Masonic. Um, you know, my I've never made a close study of the Masons. I know their place in Jim Marrs does a good job actually in his book Rule by Secrecy, where he assimilates Masons in a long line of esoteric secretive societies, including Illuminati and the legion of others going back in time, and the significant menace that secrecy in the echelons of elite poses to the world. It's certainly the threat, the flagrant contradiction to open meetings and declared allegiances that otherwise would violate oaths given to the people in taking of office, in taking a public office. Secrecy is anathema to democratic institutions, and yet these institutions are utterly avowed to secrecy. When confronted by a journalist, it was famous back when he was very much a mainstream guy, but he sort of carved a niche for himself as being kind of a gadfly. He was interviewing John Kerry back many years ago. I want to say it was back in his run up to the election in 2004, and he confronted him about his affiliation with Skull and Bones through Yale, and he said, this is a secretive society. And what can you say about the confidence the public should have in someone who's declared a contrary allegiance? Yeah, you're on the one hand, you're a U.S. senator, but on the other hand, there's that which you cannot talk about. Are you willing to share with us anything? And Kerry said flat out, no. It's secretive for a reason, and I don't say anything. The flagrant hypocrisy, right? So I'm bringing that up because it's not a nothing. There was an anti-Mason movement in this country. The architecture on that mall is indelibly Masonic. The obelisk itself wouldn't have come together except for the Freemasons, shaking each other down for donations no one else was going to take charge. Washington was himself, I think, a 33-degree Mason. Washington was devoted. All of those guys were Masons. At this point, and whenever, the balance of membership in Congress became less Mason than it had been, I couldn't tell you. But the influence on the country's founding was huge, and the influence continuously is not insignificant. I'll leave off there, and we can venture on to Mills.
As far as you mentioned the Freemason, wasn't George W. Bush, wasn't he part of Skull and Bones too?
Oh, yes, he was. Mm-hmm. And this was part of the challenge to Kerry. It's like, hey, you're running against a fraternity brother. What allegiance is going to win out? Right? And Kerry flat out dismissed the question, the challenge, the point, the relevance, flat out, just imperiously refused to engage. And relevant question, is it true that, yeah, no, it's true. And I can't say anymore. So, yeah, no, they're both skull and bones. Yeah.
There's someone that you mentioned, I believe it was the second episode we did together. It may have been the first, but I'm going to try my best to get this person onto the show because it's funny, since we're talking about this time period with George W. Bush, I have to get Mark Crispin Miller on the show because I think that's a forgotten period.
Yeah.
A lot of people. It wasn't for me. I remember that period very well. The volatility of the country, politically, the polarization that continues. That's part of the reason why we're in the situation that we're in now is because they can literally polarize any issue you can think of, and they will successfully get people to argue for or against. It doesn't matter what it is. it could be the color of your feces. It doesn't matter what it is. I mean, they will get some kind of a way for you to have an opinion about it. And they'll connect the feces to the environment, and the environment, they just find some kind of connection, and then it'll rile up the people and make them emotional.
I would
Um,
love for you to talk with Mark Crispin Miller. I have close affiliation with Mark. I have huge respect for his work, and his devotion is huge. And he's a very important figure on the point of, you get very rich perspective on that period about which he wrote significantly. And then onward, connections all the way through the COVID era, and so on. So Mark would be outstanding for your listeners. Outstanding.
and someone else that I'm going to reach out to, and it's crazy because you're on here. I think it's because I was thinking about Mark Crispin Miller. I was reading the book about Bush, the face of Bush. I think it's Cruel and Unusual Punishment.
Yeah.
Aaron Good too.
Aaron Good's a very close friend, personal friend, connected with Mark also. Aaron Good, sure.
I've been researching this stuff. I know exactly.
Okay. Yeah. Aaron has a wonderful podcast, American Exceptionalism, and he is singular in his encyclopedic knowledge of all things deep state, all things John F. Kennedy, all things sort of imperial in their connections to American institutions of governance. He's extraordinary savant, really. In his he approached Lance David Smith so many years ago. And a quick story, Lance told me about, he had this talk with this young guy who was extraordinary in the base of his knowledge of all things JFK, and that he couldn't have got from just any old books, or this guy was clearly. And Lance shared with me he wondered if he was a spook, because Lance had been targeted. Lance had been targeted for surveillance by almost certainly FBI and maybe other State Department agencies. And that on the one hand says a lot, and on the one hand it doesn't say a lot, because all sorts of intellectuals are in the scope. But Lance is singular in that, and that's a much longer story. But he got approached by Aaron, and he thought, because he'd had students come and gadfly him, and he was pretty sure they'd been put up to some. And here was Aaron, and he came and said, "Man, I wonder if this guy's, he's too smart to be true. He's too smart to be true. Someone's feeding this stuff." So to do have Aaron Good on, I don't mean to embarrass Aaron, but that's high praise coming from Lance Taven Smith. The suspicion that you've been groomed by State Department. It's not true, but it was funny. It was a funny story I teased both those guys with over the years. So anyway, I'm name dropping, like,
and I'm hoping that I can get them on my show with I didn't even know I had pull. I mean, I guess I do. Apparently, I'm getting all these guests.
Indeed, you do.
Show. But in the situation that I'm not able to get them on, hopefully you can help me get them on the show. But I think I'll be able to do it. Put a hook on there for them. But and hopefully they'll follow the show too. But I wanted to also ask you another question about the 2011 competition. Is that the only competition that they had there that you know of?
So an important distinction is that it was a design competition. It was not a endorsed competition like the Vietnam Memorial was an endorsed competition based on an act of Congress to establish a monument. There was no act of Congress to authorize a monument built to any or there was, in the case of the Washington Monument, there's no act by Congress to finish the monument. So as the history of the monument makes clear, there's been many proposals to complete it. The original plan came with a massive again, a sort of colonnaded base that just looked awful. I mean, that was Robert Mills. It looked awful. And it may have been dismissed like this doesn't work. It's Greco-Roman and Egyptian in ways just don't work. And anyway, it was too expensive. It was too big, and they didn't do it. They ended up just doing this obelisk. then there was the Macmillan Plan of 1903, which was this Beaux Arts sort of city beautiful movement was catching hold in major cities of the East Coast and a little bit in the West Coast. The city beautiful movement, and this was really a tribute to European architecture and civic planning, and it was an attempt by American elites now coming of age on the global scene as a world power to take seriously take seriously architecture, to take particularly civic architecture, how cities come together and articulate arterials and major edifice and park space and so on, because American cities had been so grungy. I mean, they were not thought of, and in some ways antagonistically associated with all sorts of influences that were considered, again, by Mills Herrenfolk un-American, and not a few elites too. They didn't want to recapitulate European stuff because that's, after all, who we revolted against. But come the end of the 19th century and industrialization and concentration of labor in cities and the growth of cities and the need to pay close attention in every way to how they were built and engineered and maintained, the City Beautiful movement came about, and it was very much signified Europe. And the mall had a plan, that the Macmillan Plan, that was very European in how it built the space and had these parterres and figurative stuff and alcoves and little ponds and so on. And it was very much domesticated, that space, in ways that it never got adopted. Why am I saying this? This was the Washington Monument was going to be sort of recapitulated that way, not unlike what Mills had in mind in the first place.
I was thinking about I had a question. As far as your dad, he was born, let's recuperate that notion again. Was he born in 1937, or was he 10 years old in 1937?
10 years old in 1937.
There we go. And what was that encounter like for him in 1937?
So I don't know that it was 37, but it wasn't long after that. A couple, I think, that I recall to you. One was he got roughed up by a schoolyard bully on his way back home. And the way he told the story, recalled to me by one of my sisters, was that, the kid didn't like him for his baseball talent and tried to beat him up for it. In the incident, a black kid in the neighborhood came upon him and a little older, and plucked this bully off my dad, told him to get lost. And I don't know what affiliation my dad had with the intervener. I don't know if he knew him. I don't know for what. I'd have to get back to my sister and see what she recalls of that story. So there was that. There was then, as a young guy playing in the semi-pro league in Portland, a ball game that he played with a Negro League, as it were, would have been called Negro League back then. And he'd tell the story the way my dad would. He was a great storyteller. He was always so exuberant. But that when he pitched these guys, they could almost not get up to the plate. They were laughing so hard that he, not in mockery, right, but that his style of pitching, they found so amusing. He was a submarine ball. He was a submarine pitcher. So he threw this very angular, leaned over, underhand, almost an underhand scooping pitch. And I don't know if it was what his father told him how to pitch. It was not overhand. It was very unconventional. And I don't know if pro ballers, who would have been an example of a submarine pitcher, but it's not like it was unheard of. But even by then in the 30s, maybe not so common. Difficult to control. But you could generate a lot of natural curve off of a submarine ball. So I don't know if they called them sinkers or what, but anyway, these guys were laughing so hard. My dad was he recalled it with good humor, like he did these things. So that's just a little vignette. I'll add to that what I haven't. My father, at what point, where, and in what venues he was outspoken, I couldn't tell you so much. But I know that he must have been, because when the head of the Urban League in 1967, I think it was Whitney Young. And Whitney Young was doing a city tour of American cities during the time for purposes that the Urban League would have in mind. And Whitney Young was a rising star then as a public figure. And that was his, that was where that's where his career took him to that point. The Planning Commission, which my father was appointed to by the mayor of the city then, Neil Goldschmidt, was frantic over how to host this luminary from East Coast, not just for his cachet and importance through his affiliation with the Urban League, but for his blackness. Portland this is 1967, and Portland was still and to this day it's a very segregated city. It's de facto segregated. De jure we can discuss, but de facto is clear. And de jure was outlawed in 1968, but as it were, the practices persist, and we know this. It's very well documented, and they were worried for what hotel would let him in and not give him a hard time in 1967. And whoever was the chair of the commission at some point settled on my dad to host him because they were really worried that someone would give him offense, and it would be a huge embarrassment for the city. And I believe that I dare say that he spent the night with us, a couple nights with us. And I think he was very decorous and very, as it were, he understood. And he didn't make a deal of it. And my dad, I have somewhere a photograph of my mother and my dad with Whitney Young, and from that era somewhere. Gosh, I might have it tucked away not too far away. Why do I mention that? Because for my father, whether it all started with getting rescued by this kid in the neighborhood, this black kid in the neighborhood, or what all it got to in his own biography, but he certainly left the impression with my mother on us kids that racism was a thing, and it was a very bad thing, and it had to be lived down one way or the other, one person at a time. And he took that seriously. And they were not political people in any sort of activist real way, but intellectually and in their devotions and in their affiliations and so on, they were very New Deal Democrats. My mother, of course, was Jewish on her mother's side, and the Holocaust stuff was what it was. My father was dispossessed, Okie from Panhandle of Texas, and that's what it was. And I think really this dispossession is something that we, as children, very much picked up on. We're very aware and very conscious, and coming up in a town like Portland that's very parochial in many ways. It's a big town, small city, but it's very parochial and very, very as it were, Presbyterian and in its devotions. I think Presbyterians were a major influence on the civic culture. I'm not saying in bad ways. I'm saying there's this sort of very, in a way, very socially conservative and very caste oriented. You knew your place, and not unlike so many small cities across this country. You sort of intergenerationally know your place. Well, that's a longer discussion, but my father was very aware of that, very aware. And he's very aware of coming up tough and coming up working class. And he was he was a gifted guy, and he made the most of that, and extremely hardworking, extremely focused, extremely disciplined in just even his daily habits, like a lot of artists are. Really, it's very disciplined in their habits, and left a big influence on all of the kids that way. But I'm drifting off here. I don't know that I've met, but I did miss making the point about Whitney Young, and that denotes a sort of continuous commitment by my father towards that which was civil rights, that which was all of that, and it left a big impression on me in a variety of ways. That are denoted by what we did together with this monument contest, that, and in all sorts of ways too that are not so relevant here.
As far as the time constraints, I brought this story up because it connects to what we're about to talk about now with Charles W. Mills. We'll have to cut it off at 4:30 Pacific for sure. Like, so we're teetering on maybe an hour and a half to talk about Mills today.
Sure. We get a lot done.
I wanted to revive that story because I don't know if you're familiar with Eddie Van Halen's story. Are you familiar with Eddie Van Halen's upbringing?
No.
But you know who Eddie Van Halen was,
Oh,
right?
sure. Yeah.
Eddie Van Halen had a Javanese mom, Indonesian mom, and a white Dutch father. But they migrated to Los Angeles during the same time period, more or less. I guess it would
Makes
be
sense.
around the 60s. It would be in the 60s, more or less.
Yeah.
They settled in Pasadena, California.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
don't think a lot of people know this, but Eddie Van Halen, RIP, but in a lot of his interviews in Dutch and even in English, I don't understand Dutch, but I know that there's been documented evidence of him making references to his childhood growing up in Pasadena, California, especially because I tried to demystify things, and you always hear there's misconceptions of what California is, what Oregon is, what the South is, all these different areas, what Washington, D.C. is. Everyone has these misunderstandings, when they're not from the area. And even people who are from that area, they try their best to preserve, I guess, certain notions of their area. You want to protect the reputation, whatever you think their reputation is of where you're from. You don't want people to think it's a bad place where you're from. But there's a misconception that Southern California was more open-minded than other parts of the country during the same time period. We're talking about the desegregation of the United States.
Yeah.
Eddie Van Halen basically described it in Pasadena during this time period in the early mid-60s as he was basically viewed as a Black person. And it seemed as a shock to the system, to the people that he was telling this to, because he's teaching people how to play the guitar at just this talk that he was invited to. And I don't think the audience expected him to talk about this kind of stuff during the talk. You could tell just based on the reaction. And he shouted out two of his friends that protected him because he was basically bullied the whole time. Growing up, the Black students were the only students that stood up for Eddie Van Halen. Because they viewed him back then, if you were a foreigner, you were basically Black to the people within that area. Like that was kind of a code. And it was eye-opening to me because I thought it took a lot of courage for him to bring that story up. Because I hadn't heard any similar stories like this about that particular area during that time period. But I bring it up because I think it's relevant to Mills when he talks about the whole notion of whiteness versus non-whiteness. And I'm going to put a clip in a second for you to kind of get your interpretation of it, so people can kind of get an introduction into how Charles W. Mills looked and kind of like his personality and also like what his thought processes were like in this 5 to 6 minute clip. It's a lot longer, but I'm just going to clip it at 5 or 6 minutes. But it made me think of just my own university, University of Tennessee, Knoxville. The fact that my mom was born November 29, 1960, but my university didn't permit its first Black student to 1960, the same year my mom was born. A lot of people lose sight of how recent that is. It's very recent. And whether it's projecting Washington, D.C. as being a non-slave town or a non-Southern city, or whether it's projecting Southern California to not be a racist area, or projecting that Oregon is not like it used to be when it didn't permit Black people in the territory. There's this, we have to keep in mind that these things, I think people are still fighting that. I honestly believe that that's still a part of the psyche of the United States. And people can say woke, 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 woke all they want, but it's a serious underbelly that hasn't been confronted all the way. I don't think that we've had a racial conversation to the extent that we involve the generational factors to where these things weren't that long ago, but there definitely seems to be an attempt to kind of make it seem like it was distant. And I think the Obama thing, because Charles W. Mills jokingly in this same lecture talks about how all of a sudden, we're post-racial because Obama got in 2008. Mm-hmm. But it really goes to show you, like, we came a long way, but I question to what extent we've really advanced in some ways, just based on the way we converse with each other. A lot of my white friends, I'm their only Black friend. That's just the reality of it. We're in an area where we have access to different people, plenty of opportunities to meet different people. I mean, I speak 4 languages because when I was a kid, I had several opportunities to interact with Latin people in my area, even in Tennessee. Yes, there were Latin people in Tennessee when I was growing up as a kid in the late 80s and the early 90s. But are you encouraged to talk to people across the aisle? And it's just, in many ways, we're just so self-segregating. And I don't think people realize how deep that runs. And you mentioned Portland, and I'm glad you mentioned Portland. But this idea of segregation is still a thing. I don't know why people make it seem like, sure, things have gotten better, but in a lot of ways, culturally, people are very ignorant still towards each other.
Yeah, gotcha. Super important point. I hope we can talk more.
And okay, so having said that, I want to share this clip with you. Let me share the screen with you so you can see. Can you see that?
I can.
And the issue I have with this is the sound. I got to make sure that the sound is available for us to hear. Because that's always the issue.
Yeah. Yeah, I know the challenge with Zoom, and there's always a little lag on tape stuff in the
Yes, here we go. Getting
recorded stuff.
With this, share the sound. So I'm going to clip this. Charles W. Mills, Liberalism and Racial Justice. You see that?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, so I'm going to play this for the audience. Maybe 5 minutes. I'm going to let's just see where I want to stop this or whatever. But we're going to hear him talk with his big accent, his Jamaican accent.
Okay, so the question then is, why is it that the critique on lines of race has not been as well represented in our textbooks as the gender critique or the class critique? And so there are 2 main reasons. So one is that race has been seen by many people as a very recent development in human history. Gender, I would assume, the oldest oppression of them all, going back to the origin of the species. There's sort of long-standing debate among feminists, when did patriarchy begin? But we know that whenever it did begin, it's a really long time ago. Class society, thousands of years. But many people have thought that race is a product of modernity, by which I mean not that, race Okay, here's a simple way of thinking it. Let us suppose we were to sort of transport this auditorium back to 1000 AD. So we're somewhere in feudal Europe. Now, it's not the case that everybody turns gray. It's not the case that everybody sort of develops the same kind of facial features and hair textures. But the argument is that people would no longer have a race. Because if you're in a feudal village, the crucial identity is going to be, are you a Christian or not? And which particular lord is it that you swear allegiance to? So race, the argument was, is not going to be a crucial category for such folks. So from this point of view, race is a product of modernity, and racial injustice, likewise, a product of modernity. So you could say, well, the reason that political philosophers and theorists have not talked about race is because, look, this is just the past few hundred years. Gender domination, way back. Class domination, way back. Race, really kind of modern. So first point to make is this narrative has been challenged. This was a narrative that was dominant after World War II, race a product of European imperialism and colonialism. Europeans go into the world, they see these different peoples, they classify them racially, that's where race comes from. But increasingly, this narrative is being challenged. And for anybody who's interested, you're going to need lots of time for this big book. Let me recommend, so this is an Israeli classicist, The Invention of Racism in Classical Antiquity. And this is a guy who knows like a zillion languages, so on every page you have to get through like footnotes in 10 different languages. So true confession time, I never made it all the way through. I made it 2/3 of the way through. I think I deserve some kind of medal for that. Anyway, so Isaac's thesis is that the conventional narrative is quite wrong, and that racism goes back to the classical world. And his argument, in fact, is that the pioneering racist theorist of the Western tradition is none other than Aristotle. Because Aristotle said some people are natural slaves, and the people he associated with this category were the Persians. So once you have a category, a stigmatizing category that's ethnically linked, Isaac says that's racism. And there are a bunch of like-minded folks had a conference a few years later, and they came up with another book, and that's one is The Origins of Racism in the West. And since then, there's been more and more work coming out claiming that you did have race in the ancient world, and you also had race in the medieval period. And in the medieval period, obviously, it's not the case that most of the population can read or write, so it's not the case that you get an influence in that point of view. But the idea is that more or less everybody is a Christian, apart from a few sort of minority religious groups. And the Christian church has an iconography, a set of images, and these images are focused in part on what are called the monstrous races. And the monstrous races include things that are clearly sort of utterly fantastic, not human. For example, they're giants, they're people with just one leg, they're hairy men, they're people whose faces are not up here but on their chests. There's a whole sort of range of these entities, but they're also human beings. And a very illuminating book, Saracens, Demons, and Jews. And this book argues, and it's sort of full of great illustrations, that you have these four categories of humans. Saracens, who are of course Muslims, Jews, Mongols, and also Ethiopians, which was a general category for Africans. And this author, Deborah Strickland, I think is her name, basically argues that these categories have an influence on the modern period, so that we enter modernity not with a sort of tabula rasa, but we already have these, when I say we, the West already has these categories in place, so that when you have the Western voyages of discovery, people already have in their heads these ways of classifying people.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there.
Sure.
And kind of just get your reaction to that, because I have my view about it when I was reading both the essay portion from Class to Race that was published after his racial contract in '97. I think it's almost a little contradictory to the racial contract, but I just want to get your initial reaction to what you just listened to.
I think you're spot on that the point he's making is a bit contradictory. It doesn't dismiss or discount anything about, essentially about the racial contract. When racialization became a normalized outlook, a normalized gaze, a normalized and then deeply integrated through epistemologies is secondary to its consequences, in my opinion. How far back we can trace it does have relevance in all sorts of ways we could tease out if we're inclined. I want to say this: the Persians were directly proximate to Greece. Greece was a subject population to the Persians for I don't know how long. Alexander the Great was a revolt. He was a revolutionary figure for the Greeks, and taking it to the center of the Persian Empire was for them, a David and Goliath ambition. And of course, Aristotle was Alexander's teacher. Almost certainly there was influence along the lines of what Mills is giving account here in all of that. I think now of, and not to be flip, but I said the Persians were directly geographically proximate. How many peoples through the eons who are geographically proximate to each other have had more disparaging things to construe about one another than do peoples who are far apart with no acquaintance? I think of the Scandinavians. I don't know where I last heard the pejoratives that the Swedes have for the Norwegians. Almost certainly the Norwegians have for the Swedes going way back. Europeans in general have a rich history of ludicrous animosities towards one another, largely based on how close they are. There's no enemy like the intimate enemy. There's no put down like the person closest to you. This is at least as old as the hills that Mills gives account here. Now to back up, he points out that Aristotle had these distinctions of the four classes. The Saracens, the Ethiopians, the Persians, and the other racialized group to be suborned under the gaze of the Greeks. I forget now which one it was. But okay, so he had classified the world in broad terms to the extent he was aware of it. It had no acquaintance with the native peoples of other continents. He only knew for his cosmopolitan experience with the Levant and with Asia Minor. So okay, and Northern Africa. Okay, fair enough. And Aristotle was a categorizer. He was a classifier. He was a proto-scientist. That's what he did. And it I think more relevant and certainly congruent with Mills and the racial contract is this impulse to categorize, this claimed prerogative to denote and claim a certain discernment that is as pseudoscientific and absurd from the standpoint of logic and solipsistic through and through, self-referenced and aggrandizing and blind spotting through and through, right? It is that impulse that Mills is giving account here for me. And that impulse is probably as old as the hills. What did the Persians think of the Greeks? So if the Persians had a counterpart presumption about those backward, grimy, sort of grungy Greeks and their claims on all things cosmopolitan, the upstarts that they were, the barbarians that they were under the empire of the Persians, as the Germans were under the Romans. It's like, yeah, this is always what's happened, and it happens as a result of the outrageous initiative taken by one group to second guess the dignity of another. And if you can walk that around the block and give it a liturgy and call it science, call it whatever you want, give it this imprimatur of some sort of cosmopolitan, sort of irreducible, sort of truth. And if you can make that hustle stick, well, you're in a long parade of disgraceful sort of short-circuiting of the potential of humanity. Good for you, Aristotle. Way to go. I take the, I just want to say it's an impulse as old as the hills. I think, though, that fundamentally in the racial contract, the point that this is a function of modernity has to be, why is that relevant? It's relevant because, back to Marx, because of the means of production. And that what is becoming monstrous in newfangled ways through industrialization that would emerge in the 18th century, start to emerge in the 18th century, and really take hold of global populations in the 19th century and produce the god-awful specter of the bazillions killed of the 20th century. Way out, probably more people killed in the 20th century alone than all of the centuries before it under warfare. Very possibly more people killed numerically than all the people killed in warfare in all of the eons of recorded time. That may be a stretch, but there it is. So what produced that? Industrialization, mechanization produced that, and bureaucracy produced that. The Egyptians had bureaucracy. The ancient Chinese had bureaucracy. Okay. But it is the industrialization process that really pressed into service colonialism. It was those practices that so deeply embedded the modern gaze and preoccupation with race that Mills gives such account in the racial contract. It seems to me it's worth making that point, that what's been going on forever, as old as the hills, is one-upping of the other and an attempt to claim the cultural high ground, to hustle your own people into forgetting about what an asshole you are towards them, and what case structures you have imposed on them, and what immiseration you have done to your own people, and redirect it to the other, to the alienated other, and blame them for all of that. That's almost certainly as old as the hills, and a hustle, if you could get away with it, was one of the first moves of all elites everywhere across time to distract their own people who they have continuously immiserated and exploited. And now we're back to Marx. And project that antagonism elsewhere than where it really belongs is on those who would, the psychopaths of history, continuously with us, up to and including the types of John Kerry and so on, who see the world in terms of a tiny elite cadre entitled to global resources, and the rest of us is so much chattel to be dispensed with when our clock is ticked off for our usefulness in the means of production. And there's the Marxist sort of wrinkle that I think Mills absolutely is incorporating in the racial contract. It doesn't dismiss the relevance of racializations the eons past. However, those racializations are only relevant insofar as they give account of a human impulse that is old as the hills and as cheap as dirt. How that has capitulated in our time is what we have to contend with.
The thing that I struggle with, I didn't see the Marx angle as much in the racial contract, if I'm being 100% honest, or at least I don't know if it's because I'm familiar with Marx. I remember even in high school, I think the first Marx book I read was like, it was called Marx on Religion. It was the first book that I read because I was intrigued by Marx back then, the Communist Manifesto, all that stuff. But when I read the racial contract,
No, yeah. You're
I,
correct. I'm confabulating race and class from race to class with a racial contract. I beg pardon. You're absolutely.
okay.
You don't need me to agree with you, Kiko. I just didn't want you to have to. Yes,
No,
I didn't want you to have to finesse and be polite. The point. Your point is
oh, you
taken.
know,
I'm confabulating the two. The racial contract is getting into social contract theory. It's social contract theory, and it's redressing social contract theory and how racism is so embedded in that tradition, that intellectual tradition. Yeah.
and honestly, I saw it as like there's a lot of people who shout out to Solange Munoz. Solange Munoz is in the geography department at UT Knoxville, and she introduced me to two theorists, Emmanuel Wallerstein and
Yeah.
Aníbal Quijano, and they wrote a very important article in 1992 entitled "Americanity as a Concept." And I thought of those two when I was reading the racial contract because
Yeah.
the whole idea of the new world and this context of the terms white, black, all these terminologies, these racial signifiers previous to the transatlantic slave trade, for instance, um, previous to the establishment of a lot of countries that didn't even have their independence until 1812 or whenever it was in Latin America and the Americas. A lot of countries way later than that, um, even though they're quote unquote independent, didn't actually end slavery till way after their days of independence. Brazil being the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery in 1888 officially, but Princess Isabella. Cuba 1886, Puerto Rico 1873. Um, and these are very, at the time, they were black majority countries. A lot of people lose sight of that before the influx of Syrian immigration, European immigration into these areas in the Caribbean. You had different dynamics. You had a lot of East Indian people moving in. Every area had its different influences. But the point being is that it made me think of those culture theories. Homi Bhabha is another one, an Indian cultural critic. The whole idea of mimicry, the othering of people, because just reading some of the tenets of the racial contract, it was very straightforward to me. And I think that's why it was easier to digest than from class to race, which you have to be really versed, I think, in Marx to kind of get an understanding of that book and the collection of essays in that particular publication. But the two ones that stood out to me in the racial contract, these two statements, they're really three, but I'll stick to two. The one that says here, the racial contract as a theory is explanatorily superior to the raceless social contract in accounting for the political and moral realities of the world and in helping to guide normative theory. And then you go back to the economics, which I can kind of see a Marx link here in the racial contract, where he says the racial contract is an exploitation contract that creates global European economic domination and national white privilege. But that also goes into Wallerstein's idea of core versus periphery, which is basically saying, and if you want to digest that even more, that's some kind of crazy statistic where you could combine all the periphery countries and it wouldn't be anywhere close to the core countries as far as GDP, but yet all the natural resources are in the periphery countries. So
Yeah.
who's coming up with these categories like core, periphery? I mean, obviously Wallerstein came up with that, but the basis is still going back to what Mills is talking about. This whole idea of establishing almost like a white order in a way versus everyone else.
Yeah.
And I think Mill's concerns as far as like the origin and stuff, I'm honestly not even that concerned about the origin of itself. I'm more concerned about just the context within different historical periods and how that goes into modernity. How do you define modernity? I don't know. but it's that's probably going to be different for different people. For me, modernity within the context of Mills, even though he tries to make it seem, um, he argues that racism happened a lot earlier, but I would still argue that it still goes back to the certain point of this idea of the new world. I think that's where the crossroads really starts to happen with the transatlantic slave trade. And then people would say, well, where was the justification to determine that blacks would be the slaves versus the indigenous people? Because they tried that with the indigenous people with the blood laws, the cleanliness of the blood laws, the Spanish did. But for whatever reason, the indigenous people did not fall into that category. The blacks fell into the category, the sub-Saharan blacks. I think that's kind of like what intrigued me about that whole period is when was the transition to where, okay, the black people are going to be the ones that we use for the labor. Like that is kind of like the big question I've had. And I think Mills kind of inadvertently, he comments a lot about that himself, even though he's, I think all over the place in some aspects.
Lots to chew off there, Kiko. I think core periphery, Wallerstein's construct there, so it's irreducibly geographical, and it's other things too. It's got metaphor, it's got other stuff going on to it. I think with regard to the black, the settling upon for under modernity's ambitions, the slavery, the resuscitation of the slave institution with blacks is instead of indigenous, has a couple parts that I don't claim to be any well read in, but for what it's worth, where you could extract people from their own land and subject them to the the passage. How do we denote the passage across the Atlantic? The black something passage.
The middle passage?
The what?
The middle passage?
Of course, the middle passage. That Wallerstein does not incorporate that in my recollection for his core periphery, and how critically important that passage was to the bewilderment, befuddling, the deracination of the people subjected to it. So whereas people who were indigenous were of the land, and although the Spaniards and the Portuguese certainly pressed them into service for a period, they were, I think, fundamentally, insofar as they had shared language, and they had the shared territory, and they knew the ins and outs of, were always in a position to be defiant in ways that those subjected to the Middle Passage were not. They in many instances did not share the same language. In more than a few instances, they were antagonistic tribally. They were made vulnerable that way, and then churned together in the most bewildering, nightmarish conditions. Indentured servitude that in a fashion has been practiced by all peoples of the world forever. Native Americans practiced it. And we attribute to them a kind of slavery that wasn't bonded, but essentially indentured servitude of those who were captured in battle. And they were subjected to something not unlike the indentured servitude of Europeans for a specified period, and they'd buy their way out. They'd earn their way out. They might even earn prestige within the tribe that they were subjected by. They might marry up. They might do all sorts of things, but it was a specified time period practiced almost universally. And there it was. It was eons old. This eons old practice of conquest people to earn their place by those who had, as it were, nominally captured or conquered them. But bonded slavery was something different. This was in perpetuity, and it was an artifact of not to be reductive here, but of the economics of the proposition. If slaves could buy their way into society like the indentured servants, then the institution was made precarious. And fundamentally, in the American context in particular, they could not, the plantation economy could not maneuver poor whites into a caste position without blacks. Having blacks as the lowest caste was a pressure releaser on the plantation South towards the whites who were dirt poor, and suffered those conditions really under a caste society that was the colonial America from the beginning. It was the caste structure of that class society was carried over in a big way from England, and which is a society that remains very classist to this day, in ways that are culturally deep, like America is not, like the US is not. Of course, we have social class. Of course, we have differential access to the means of production. Yes, 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 to those Marxist shibboleths, absolutely. But the cultural embeddedness of class affiliations we got in the colonial time from the England, and that hostility towards the suborned class was a big part of westward expansion. Was the only way to redeem the creed, the founding creed of liberty and freedom, was access to land, and the colonial elites were not going to be giving up any. So there was this nominally open land, and that needed another narrative, right? It needed this recapitulation of the early Christian attributions of the native as heathen, unchristian, and reassimilated in the 19th century under manifest destiny doctrine that was derived from the Christian assumptions that the heathen was not their labor. And this gets to the social contract stuff too that Mills gets into, that their labor produced nothing of enduring value, and for that matter, their land as a constituent part of the means of production was not possessed by them. They could not claim deed title to it. There was no record of any ownership in the first place. And the argument, the justification for manifest destiny and the dispersal had many moving part components to it. A big part of it was instigation. They would hurl poor people, desperate people westward on flim-flammy promises, and they would encounter more or less ambivalent, if not hostile, indigenous folks. And what would happen would be inevitably some kind of conflict, some kind of skirmish, probably more often than not, provocateurs sent out with these poor, desperate people who were state agents, were there to stir shit up, not unlike January 6th. FBI agents there were more FBI agents than anyone else there, provocateurs. Almost certainly this formula goes way back. And so they would stir the shit, as it were, in the westward expansion. They would be the belligerent, the gun-toting, the Indian hostile whites who would stir the shit. And whereas otherwise these settlers may have assimilated to their circumstances, in many instances they did, and they would make, if not common cause, then a tenuous peace with the indigenous, the tribal peoples. The shit would get stirred. There'd be a fight, and then there would be wagons circled, as it were, and then would come the forts. And the building of the forts was based on always the hostilities of the Indians, and not on the provocateurs that would stir the shit, you know. And this goes way back to the very beginning. And so there's various moving parts going on here to why Black slavery was necessary, right, to the epistemology of the New World.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's where I got really compelled by what I think is the major contribution of Mills in the racial contracts is the epistemology of racism. With your indulgence, could I share some of that? Could I share some slides on that? Do you want to come back more?
Yes, I want to give a shout out to Rachel Sarah O'Toole. And I want to make it very clear that the comment I made earlier was not to be it's a very complicated situation because the indigenous person and the Black person during this colonial time period, this enslavement period, the roles had to be very stratified and defined. Is not to say that one had it better than the other. I did not want to say that in the previous comment. It's very complicated, especially in Latin America. It's super complicated because you have to understand. I think Matthew made a great point earlier about you have people coming across the Atlantic Ocean against their will versus people who were already in this, more or less in these territories. So you had to have a different strategy, I guess, from the European standpoint to find a way to colonize them in different ways. I mean, sure, maybe Christianity would have been the end game, but then you also had language barriers. You had other things you had to deal with, but there's also topographical issues, especially if you're talking about the Andes Mountains. You could argue that the indigenous people were enslaved. There were slaves that were indigenous throughout the Americas. And we know who were doing the mining during that time period when the Spaniards were basically trying to establish their viceroys all over Latin America, in Lima, in Bogota, in Caracas, and all these different places. The Spaniards tried to have their headquarters, but the issue is that a lot of the time the Spaniards didn't know what the hell was going on in these new territories because they would send people over basically as like ambassadors or whatever the hell you want to call them, conquistadores, whatever. They dispatch these people over that represent the crown, but in reality, they didn't know what the hell was going on in the territories. They didn't know what was going on the ground with all the harsh labor and all the bad conditions. But there's a book that highlights a lot of the relationships between indigenous and Black people, especially. It's called Bound Lives, Africans, Indians, and the Making of Race in Colonial Peru. Really interesting book. I had the wonder of talking to Rachel Sarah O'Toole when I was in my PhD program at UT Knoxville. Worth a look, Bound Lives, really important book, I think, to establish how people perceived race in Peru back then during the colonial period. And I think there's a lot of intersection between what Mills is doing too in his book, The Racial Contract. But you said you had some slides to show.
Do you mind if I do?
No problem. And we can maybe
it's largely extractions of Mills in his own words, which are so lucid. And rather than try to secondhand him, I thought I'd just put these to work for us and see what we could make of it together. Kiko, let me go into what as it were, the racial contract, why epistemology matters, how the structure of knowledge production matters. So in his own words, he says, the great virtue of traditional social contract theory of the 17th and 18th century was that it provided seemingly straightforward answers both to factual questions about the origins and workings of society and government, and to normative questions about the justification of socioeconomic structures and political institutions. From its 1650 to 1800 heyday as a grand quasi-anthropological account of the origins and development of society and the state, the contract has now become just a normative tool, a conceptual device to elicit our intuitions about justice. But, he goes on to say, my usage is different. And here, Mill's derivation of contract theory is in some sense more in keeping with the classical Enlightenment theorists like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, for his attempt to restore our understanding of how contract has been inflected with privileges, in particular, those acquired as a result of the racialization of the world population. He begins with pointing out that the social contract has historically been partitioned between a political contract, giving an account of the origins of government on the one hand, and a moral contract, giving account of the origins of moral codes, normative structures, so on. Humanity was said to have emerged from a mythologized state of nature into a realm of order and governance under classical European contract theory. So for that matter, Locke and Kant in this legacy, this order and governance was built on a pre-existing morality. For Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, governing authority evolves in tandem with moral conventions that regulate behavior and expectations. For Rousseau, the moral order compromises with technological progress in a constant struggle against its dehumanizing tendencies. So there's the one class, the Locke and Kant, the British, the Continental and the German, the Continental and the British. This order and governance was built on a pre-existing morality. And they give account in their writings of this sort of ancient legacy of morality from their perspective. For Hobbes, who was a contemporary of Locke, governing authority evolves in tandem with moral conventions that regulate behavior and expectations. Hobbes, in comparison with Locke, generally how he's introduced, right, is that he was the guy for whom this famous claim, life is nasty, brutish, and short. And historically, nasty, brutish, and short. And for that matter, governing institutions that fail to take into consideration this fundamental basis of human existence are governments that don't survive long. And here he almost certainly had in mind Machiavelli and the Prince and the Republic and so on. And so governing institutions have evolved where they have succeeded to take account of and have been a response to the brutal conditions of life where there is no overarching authority, that everyone is in constant contest with everyone else. This is sort of a foundational perspective of Hobbes, different from Locke and Kant, who begin with kind of a proto-civilized people who had established traditions and covenants and compacts within, among, and across their tribal affiliations that always mitigated for the primeval hostility people have and the aggressive tendencies they have, that there were these leavening influences. Okay, it's both and it's all, but they carved out in these different theorists. For Rousseau, different. Rousseau glimpsed the dehumanizing prospects of where society was headed under the influence of industrialization already in the late 18th century, late 1700s. And he dreaded what this portended, and he was, for that matter, a major thinker and influence for the Romantic era, so-called, of the early 19th century, which in one perspective was very much an elite reaction to the mass society that could be glimpsed moving forward at that point, cosmopolitan mass society headed for industrialization. And that the genteel decorum of elite society would be leveled by the influences of mass culture. And the Romantic era was this reaction to that. It was also, in its way, it lionized revolution, and it used Rousseau as one of its founding influencers, that revolution was the great emancipator of humanity. But always within that gaze was a very tendentious, conflicted notion of the better impulses of humanity against the worst impulses of humanity. That the worst impulses were what Hobbes said, don't kid yourself. We're all the worst at any given moment. And Locke and Kant were like, we're actually at any given moment a temperate creature capable of tender sentiments. And this would connect back with Rousseau. It was the tender sentiments that Rousseau was most concerned with, and that became such fodder for the Romantics of the early the Byron, the Shelley, the Yeats, the poets, right? The artists, Delacroix, David, others that were in the revolutionary sort of rapture of the late 18th and early 19th century into the Napoleonic era. It really died with Napoleon. It started with the American Revolution, and it died with Napoleon. And so he continues. He says, Mills tells us, is not enough, however, to explain how the understanding of contract came to be partitioned across a differentiated humanity under the influence of the colonization that produced the modern world. And here you pick up a contradiction with Mills, who talks about racialization is at least as old as Aristotle. Because in this book, he really says, no, it's the differentiated humanity under the influence of colonization that really we ought to be concerned with. Okay. So for that matter, as you say, it's all very interesting, but we have to take account of what's before us in any given epoch. Under the gaze of colonization, for that matter, Mills tells us, the role played by the state of nature then becomes radically different. In the white settler state, which he makes a lot of in the racial contract, its role is not primarily to demarcate the temporarily pre-political state of all men, who are really white men, but rather the permanently pre-political state, or perhaps better, the non-political state, insofar as pre-suggests eventual internal movement toward, of non-white men. The establishment of society thus implies the denial that a society already existed, indigenous people. The creation of society requires the intervention of white men, who are thereby positioned as already socio-political beings, up against those who are pre-political at best, but essentially made non-political under the gaze of this or that Aristotle, of this or that era. This required a psychological splitting, I say, process to occur that established ordinal points of humanity, white, non-white, for which church doctrine would not be sufficient for establishing governance prerogatives across a new world. A new way of seeing self and other, necessary for social contract theory to retain its relevance for colonizing interests. And this is where Mills pivots, it seems to me, in this book, from the religious gaze on the indigenous to the racialized gaze upon the everyone in these subcategories of race. He says classical contract theorists each had to establish some basis in human understanding for rational thought and action necessary to explain the substance and place of base desires in deference to collective purposes. Locke and Rousseau both theorized that human impulses were not inherently wicked, emerging as they did from a radical state of freedom and equality, an imagined radical state of freedom and equality. Never mind that indigenous people everywhere for always have had some derivation of an institution of indentured servitude. Never mind, but it's sort of, Locke and Rousseau needed this mythologized origins in freedom and beneficence to build their vision of governing of social contract. For Locke, rationality was an innate capacity endowed by a benevolent God, driven by an instinct for self-preservation on a par with appreciation for shared purposes among and across people. For Rousseau, human rationality was foundational to our capacity for joy, love, and communion. Innate drives forever vulnerable to the dehumanizing influence of modernity, division of labor, bureaucracy, etc. Hobbes was much more conservative on all of this. In a world becoming partitioned by the European us versus the heathen them, contract theory needed to abridge the intellectual consensus on what was the basis for rationality of humanity. Under the colonizing gaze, rationality was refashioned into a scarce asset of limited endowment. In order for this partitioning of human endowment to become naturalized, there was required an implicit epistemological contract that whites had to adopt, a way of seeing themselves and others according to a schemata of negation. Whatever we ever were, we were never them, and they shall never be us. As Mills suggests, we can think of this as an idealized consensus about cognitive norms, and in this respect, an agreement of contract or of sorts. So he writes, There is an understanding about what counts as correct, objective interpretation of the world. And for agreeing to this view, one is contractually granted full cognitive standing in the polity, the official epistemic community. So here it could be said, one has an agreement to misinterpret the world. One has to learn to see the world wrongly, but with the assurance that this set of mistaken perceptions will be validated by white epistemic authority, whether religious or secular. Now, here's what I think is his major contribution, is to see the world wrongly and to accept this a mistaken presumption that we can see in Aristotle himself, a presumption that is as old as the hills and it is as cheap as dirt. But it serves this, it perpetually and recurrently serves certain purposes through the eons. Mills continues. He says, thus, in effect, on matters related to race, the racial contract prescribes for its signatories, those signing on to the contract, an inverted epistemology, an epistemology of ignorance, a particular pattern of localized and global cognitive dysfunctions, which are psychologically and socially simultaneously functional, producing the ironic outcome that whites will in general be unable to understand the world they themselves have made. One could say then, as a general rule, that white misunderstanding, misrepresentation, evasion, and self-deception on matters related to race are among the most pervasive mental phenomena of the past few hundred years, a cognitive and moral economy psychically required for conquest, colonization, and enslavement. And here he's updating the racial contract from Aristotle, that it's white. It has a white, for Aristotle, white was not a category, right? Whiteness, blackness, this continuum was not a category. It was a cultural facet. And that is as old as the hills. Racialization in the phenotypic way in which it's been constructed is an artifact of modernity. This has to be distinguished. And how that inflects in this epistemology of ignorance is very important. And these phenomena are in no way accidental, but prescribed by the terms of the racial contract, which requires a certain schedule of structured blindness and opacities in order to establish and maintain the white polity. And here you have, giving account of this, famously, our psychologists, Kenneth and Mamie Clark, demonstrated that segregation harmed Black children's self-images. It would so happen that testimony on this before the Supreme Court, how it also affected white children, was of more influence on the court than how it hurt Black children, which is an interesting artifact of this. So their testimony before Supreme Court contributed to the landmark Supreme Court case in Brown v. the Board of Education about the selecting of white dolls over Black dolls was part of that famous component of the testimony. And then he goes into these subsidiary contracts, right? He talks about the expropriation contract, the slavery and the colonial contracts. For me, it's the epistemological contract that I think is most elusive, significant, and his really important contribution here. But for what it's worth, to round off, the racial contract has been activated, he says, by subsidiary terms and agreements necessary to secure resources and people around the world. And here's where modernity enters, and where his quibble, very important quibble with Marxism, it materializes. So there's the expropriation contract, the slavery contract, and the colonial contract. For the expropriation contract, under the doctrine of discovery, colonial nations established for themselves what Joseph Story on the bench from 1812 to 45 described as follows: absolute dominion over the whole territories afterwards occupied by them, not in virtue of any conquest of or cession by the Indian natives, but as a right acquired by discovery. The title of the Indians was not treated as a right of property and dominion, but as a mere right of occupancy. As infidels, heathens, and savages, they were not allowed to possess the prerogatives belonging to absolute sovereign and independent nations. The territory over which they wandered and which they used for their temporary and fugitive purposes was, in respect to Christians, deemed as if it were inhabited only by brute animals. Part of that is quotation attributed to Story. Part of it comes from elsewhere, and that's the link there where we can get more. The slavery contract revivified slavery as an institution long after it had been dead in Europe, right? Based on doctrines of the inherent inferiority of Native Americans and Africans, as you brought up earlier. And you mentioned the author who makes this nuanced connection, particularly localized in Peru, I think it was.
Yeah,
A classic testament. What?
Rachel Sarah O'Toole.
And the title of the book again?
Is Bound Lives.
Bound Lives. I'm not familiar with it. Thank you. So a classic testament of this doctrine Mills is giving account was the Dred Scott decision issued by the U.S. Supreme Court in Dred Scott v. Sanford, where Chief Justice Taney wrote that blacks had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. His is a vague pronoun reference. Did he mean for the black person's benefit themselves, to be custodial under the prerogative of whites, or for the white benefit? Both and? Not clear. This opinion was at the time fixed and universal in the civilized portion of the white race. It was regarded as an axiom in morals as well as in politics, which no one thought of disputing or supposed to be open to dispute. Well, that's a bit of a broad claim. The abolitionists did dispute this. Other intellectuals disputed this. By then, famously, Frederick Douglass, Frederick Douglass came later, didn't he? So this is the Dred Scott was before, but it was not beyond the parlance of the Quakers. It was not beyond the parlance of other Protestant groups to dispute this. So there's that. The colonial contract, finally, European rule over Asia, Africa, and the Pacific, Oceania, was codified through practice, decisions, and policies captured well by the notion of association given here by French imperial theorist Jules Armand. This comes from Mills, pages 25 to 26. From Mills, the norming of back up. That was passages on page 25 and 26. Quickly. Expansion by conquest, however necessary, seems especially unjust and disturbing to the conscience of democracies. But to transpose democratic institutions into such a setting is aberrant nonsense. The subject people are not and cannot become citizens in the democratic sense of the term. It is necessary then to accept as a principle and point of departure the fact that there is hierarchy of races and civilizations, and that we belong to the superior race and civilization. This is from Jules Armand, born 1845 to 1921. The basic legitimation of conquest over native peoples is the conviction of our superiority, not merely our mechanical, economic, and military superiority, but our moral superiority. Our dignity rests on that quality, and it underlies our right to direct the rest of humanity. He goes on. Without falling into Rousseauian reveries, it is worth noting that association implies a contract, and this idea, though nothing more than an illustration, is more appropriately applied to the coexistence of two profoundly different societies thrown sharply and artificially into contact than it is to the single society formed by natural processes which Rousseau envisaged. This is how the terms of this implicit agreement can be conceived. The European conqueror brings order, foresight, and security to a human society which, though ardently aspiring for these fundamental values, without which no community can make progress, still lacks the aptitude to achieve them from within itself. With these mental and material instruments, which it lacked and now receives, it gains the idea and ambition for a better existence and the means of achieving it. We will obey you, say the subjects, if you begin by proving yourself worthy. We will obey you if you can succeed in convincing us of the superiority of that civilization of which you talk so much. Here we get an extract from the master-slave dialectic that Hegel had formulated, that there is the very intimate precincts of the master and the slave are very reciprocal, continuous, and constantly in negotiation. And he gives, and Armand gives account of here without attribution, it seems to me, of the master-slave dialectic that Hegel had articulated. Okay, so the colonial contract. Mills writes further, Indian laws, slave codes, and colonial native acts formally codified the subordinate status of non-whites and ostensibly regulated their treatment, creating a juridical space, a legal space for non-Europeans as a separate category of beings. So even if there was sometimes an attempt to prevent abuses, so-called, and these codes were honored far more often in the breach than the observance, the point is that abuse is as a concept presupposes as a norm the legitimacy of the subordination in the first place. Slavery and colonialism are not conceived as wrong in their denial of autonomy to persons, fundamentally wrong outright, but only wrong. But what is wrong is the improper administration of those regimes. So you would have the figure of the benevolent colonizer, in contrast to the brutal foreman. You know, the benevolent plantation owner who didn't want the foreman, who challenged the foreman his abuses, and the foreman would retort, you know, like Jack Nicholson on the stand in A Few Good Men, you can't handle the truth. You know, that just sort of, that was their dialect. You can't handle the truth. You hired me to deal with you. You are so ignorant and smug. You have no idea what is going on here, you know? And then so Mills continues, that it would be a fundamental error then, a point to which he will return, to see racism as anomalous, a mysterious deviation from European Enlightenment humanism. Rather, it needs to be realized that in keeping with a Roman precedent, European humanism usually meant that only Europeans were human. European moral and political theory, like European thought in general, developed within the framework of the racial contract and as a rule took it for granted. As Edward Said points out in Culture and Imperialism, we must not see culture as, quote, antiseptically quarantined from its worldly affiliations. But this occupational blindness has in fact infected most professional humanists, unable to make the connection between the prolonged and sordid cruelty of practices such as slavery, colonialism, and racial oppression and imperial subjection on the one hand, and the poetry, fiction, philosophy of the society that engages in these practices on the other. Actually, that's Said, that's not Mills. So Mills continues, by the 19th century, conventional white opinion casually assumed the uncontroversial validity of a hierarchy of higher and lower, master and subject races for whom it is obvious different rules must apply. Here's my point for what it's worth. There's an accretion over time of an epistemological project, which is a tacit consensus about higher and lower, sophisticated, not sophisticated, civilized and uncivilized. It's a tacit consensus because once you engage the so-called consensus discursively, it falls apart. It immediately starts to fall apart. So you have to keep repeating the presumptions, and you have to do it in a hortatory way, and you have to do it in derivative ways in all over the place, in newspaper headlines and from bully pulpits and from more genteel precincts of dinner clubs and cotillions. You have to perpetually reinforce what is a set of fallacious presumptions. A profound ignorance is the basis for the racial contract. A profound ignorance that has these strata of sublimating and denial and split thinking. The racial contract is based fundamentally on a kind of psychological disorder that has never been labeled as such, but should have been. The so-called Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is the Bible of all things clinical psychology, I don't think has this category, but it should. This is a form of dissociative thinking, which is foundational, and for that matter, completely elusive to this society by those who are the beneficiaries and who are the natural adherents of it. Back to the film The Matrix. The people of Zion in the film, the exiles, are distinctively of color. The people within the Matrix are distinctively white. It seems to me, again, there's clearly a parable in that science fiction genre of this whiteness, blackness, this epistemological, this profound ignorance of the extent to which the adherents to those who are beneficiaries are themselves profoundly unfree. And in the Matrix, they are pod people. They are actually sustained by a monstrous megalith that determines what they think, how they feel, what their attachments are, their ambitions, and so on. And to me, this is what Mills is talking about here. This is fundamentally what he's talking about. Norming races and spaces, the dialectic of circularity and negation. He gets in then at some point to the geography of racism, which is fundamental, and it is a recapitulation, it seems to me, of the Middle Passage. It is a way of separating and isolating groups. One, beneficiaries who are adherents to racial conduct because they benefit from it, although in profound ways they are injured by it. As the Clarks gave account before the Supreme Court, whites are in weirdly equivalent ways injured by racism because it stunts their growth. It dehumanizes them in equal and opposite measure as it does to Black people and people of color. And this is the segregation, the geographic segregation that was practiced from 1949 de jure in the United States and persists to this day, absolutely persists to this day in real estate practices, is, to me, it's an apartheid state. And he gives reference in Social Contract to the demographers, Massey and Denton, who wrote the book American Apartheid, The Making of the Underclass, The Making of the American Underclass. And it's a deep demographic dive in a companion way. It was published in 1993. A deep companion dive to his racial contract. And I think it had an influence. Mills was not a geographer by training, but he read Massey and Denton. And that was Bible to me in my understanding of race and racialization, and completely turned my head when I realized the extent to which the instrumentalities of urban planning had been pressed into service for creating apartheid in the U.S. from 1949, the Housing Act 1949. That turned my head, and he read that, and I think it had a significant influence on him. That racism requires for its recapitulation a geography. It absolutely depends upon ordinal points of entitlement, of exclusion. Back to Wallerstein, core and periphery. But the core and periphery has many subnodes within it. It has, within every city, has its core and periphery, right? So he gives account of that, and really, like, he's very nimble. Mills is so nimble, and his writing is just so exquisite. And so he gives account then in these passages that I don't have to further belabor this, but it's an important feature in order to create this amnesia and to undermine the probability of people encountering each other in youth across the stigmata and illusion of racializations. You need geographic separation. The Herrenfolk impulses of the mid-20th century were not triggered up so much by college desegregation, because they knew by then it was far too late for whites and Blacks to really make common cause. What really they were antagonized by was primary school integration. That was closely policed North and South. So what it would take to get past the racial contract is fundamentally a reinscription of our geography. And laws that would stick, that would facilitate true integration. it's so far after the fact to have DEI initiatives in workplaces when everyone goes home to different neighborhoods. Yeah, they go home to different churches. They go home different ballparks. They go home and not different merely in quality or merely in location, but in quality. The one goes home to those that are underfunded, a tax base that is always hobbled and depleted, and the other goes always to surplus. And the presumption that we find ourselves in workplaces that are somehow equivalent, but for the grace of knowing how to talk with each other in polite terms is a cheat. It really is fundamentally a cheat. I am not dismissing the hard work, diversity, equity, inclusion, people. That's not my point. I do have more than a quibble with wokeism, but I am certainly not criticizing earnest, devoted, hard work. Not easy to get at the artifacts of geographic apartheid in the precincts of nominally integrated workplaces. That is not easy work, and it's not unimportant work, but it is facsimile work relative to what's going on the rest of the day through our lives. And to presume that because we have these initiatives, somehow we're going to make great strides and change is a fallacy. And it risks a new orthodoxy. It risks an orthodoxy of a kind of groupthink, ordinal presumptions about victims, ordinal presumptions about responsibility, that recapitulate mistakes that Martin Luther King understood very, very clearly were going to perpetually bring us down. And I don't mean to be cryptic. There's a lot there we could unpack, but I see this is where Mills is going. I don't think Mills would be pleased by what is sort of materializing under the gaze of woke. I think he would be very critical. He would see this as largely distractions, particularly the sexualization of distinctions, as largely distraction, and not with lacking fidelity to the fundamental challenge. For what I want prepared for my responsibility to you, Kiko, is the transition then to race. It's from class to race. I got to check with us our time. It's almost time up, but this is the comparison table he makes in late in the book, chapter of the book, where he juxtaposes the presumptions. And it's clear where he lands, right? What his position is, and where he gives account. Real quick, it might be worth running down quickly these juxtapositions, and then So he, in this table that he offers, it's a later chapter. It's a presentation that he gave to colleagues at a Marxist symposium, and where he almost got hissed off the days. So he differentiates class and race, a foundational category, genealogy, origins, meta-narratives. For class, and this is traditional Marxist, class society and capitalism, class is the fundamental social division, is their orientation. For race theorists, European expansionism, white settler state, white supremacy, race as the fundamental social division. Never mind these black bars here. He doesn't have any. I tried to make a table and it came out weird, wonky, coming from Word into PowerPoint. I don't intend any categories here with these black lines. Class is the relationship to ownership of dispossession from the means of production. Base relations of production supposedly determines the superstructure, the state, the legal system, ideology. For race theorists, race as a relationship to entitlement to exclusion from full personhood. Racial base relations of personhood definitely does determine the superstructures of state, legal system, and ideology. For Marxists, state ostensibly is a bourgeois phenomenon dominated by the capitalist class, owners of the means of production. For critical race theory, state clearly is a racial state dominated by whites, the full persons, regardless of their class standing. For Marxists, the bourgeoisie as the ruling class, polity supposedly a bourgeois democracy, even with universal suffrage. For critical race theorists, whites as the ruling race. Polity, obviously a Herrenvolk democracy, even with universal suffrage. Marxists, the legal system establishes and consolidates capitalism, though it undergoes change over time, as with from laissez-faire to state intervention. For critical race theorists, the legal system establishes and consolidates white supremacy, though it undergoes changes over time, de jure to de facto. A race-neutral, post-racial to DEI and woke, for instance. Hegemonic bourgeois ideology naturalizes, justifies class domination, workers as alienated from their products, supposedly affecting their being fundamentally. Critical race sees it differently. Hegemonic white settler ideology naturalizes, justifies racial domination, non-whites alienated from their personhood, unquestionably affecting their being fundamentally. Castro understood this, that in Cuba, nominally the outpost of Marx in the sort of the Western Hemisphere clearly recognized that racialization was an issue in Cuba. Then how to get over this nominally under a governance regime that denied it was a real problem, and what never to be, certainly not with Castro, resolved. Workers as exploited, labor theory of value at the point of production, transfer surplus to the bourgeoisie who benefit from class exploitation. Non-whites as exploited through slavery, land expropriation, market discrimination, rent, lower wages, general denial of equal opportunities, net transfer of wealth, land, surplus opportunities in general to white population who benefit from racial exploitation. All very well documented. Class, race. Class interests, notion of privileged classes having vested group interest in class order. Racial interests, notion of whites having vested group interest in the racial order. Finally, socio-historical trends are supposed to lead, but haven't, to workers becoming class conscious so that the system can be changed. The racial view of this, racialized view, people are already and have been for hundreds of years racially conscious, with the white majority intent on retaining the system unchanged. Certainly, a historical record is very clear on this, where whites, working class, had opportunity through the mid-century to face down racism through union affiliation and practices. They didn't. Where they knew what was going on post 1949 with the construction of exclusively white suburbs, they kept them that way. When they felt threatened by the so-called invasion of other people in their neighborhoods, they reacted, sometimes violently. All of it is well documented. And so the racialization thesis has much going for it over and against the class premise, and how these can be reconciled, whatever, if at all they need to be. I had a thought, I lost it. I know we're up against time. I've talked an awful lot here. I'm sorry. I wanted to be responsive to your ask that we get into this material, and so this is what I got. The last, I opened with Toni Morrison and Maya Angelou last time. The very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Maya Angelou, prejudice is a burden that confuses the past, threatens the future, and renders the present inaccessible. All of this requires, they speak here poetically to epistemology. They speak here to a befuddling epistemology, a way in which split thinking by whites undermines an inclination to be cosmopolitan, to learn across race, class, privilege, and always puts that responsibility on the back of those who are subordinated to it. It makes the Black person, the brown person, the broker in one classroom after another, one schoolyard after another, one playground after another, one venue after another as the broker, the peacemaker, the whatever, and the whites are sort of constantly guarded. perpetually guarded in these exchanges. And so we get, as a result, a legacy, an extraordinary legacy of art, creative, intellectual work, contributions by, I'll speak here of Black people in America, particularly in unique and distinctive ways in America, that is in some ways fundamentally an articulation of this epistemological contract. It is an artistic, creative, intellectual disputation against that, and there, but for the grace of a more canny, a less befuddled white populace, what would we have? You know, I've actually early in my career, at least once, recall students, and I can't tell you now, white, Black, or otherwise, saying, well, Dr. Witt, if what you talk about, we're not going to dispute what you're talking about, but it would be kind of a shame. Think of all that we would lose creatively and everything that you give account if we were a fully integrated society. Now, the student speaks to cosmopolitanism and the beauty and cultural enrichment that cosmopolitanism has endowed human cultures forever. What they leave out is the brutality. Mm-hmm. They're leaving that out, right? As an unnecessary surplus repression, as Marcuse would put it, surplus repression, unnecessary repression, an artifact of what exactly? I think it's an artifact of a need to preserve a white fragility. I think that's what it is. I think that preserving and incubating white fragility is what that's an artifact of.
Doctor, we'll definitely have to continue this conversation. We'll have to bring you back on in April, and we will have to discuss this further for sure. And we can dedicate just an episode to Mills. It's very noteworthy, in my opinion. There's just so much overlap between Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, a lot of the Caribbean counterparts. It makes sense. I mean, he's Caribbean descent himself, the West Indian influences. I think it's very clear that it's there. There's a lot of questions I have, just the links between, or the potential links between CRT and Marxism. You know, if we can establish a line there at all, those would be some explorations that I will look at in that next episode. And the whole idea of Marxism and Black political advocacy, can those two things coexist? Can you juggle them at the same time? Or does one thing prioritized over the other, whether it's class, race? Then you start getting into intersectionality, which basically premises that you can factor in these things at the individual level, class, race, gender, any income level, any sort of signifier or indicator of differentiation, that you can break those things down in a way to where it makes sense universally to the person, and furthermore to society. There's just a lot more we can discuss today, but unfortunately we just don't have the time to do it. But do you have any final words to share with my audience, and the quickest way that someone could get in touch with you in case they had a question or comment?
They can certainly email me. What's best way? My work email is the easiest to repeat. Witt, Matthew, mwitt@laverne.edu. mwitt@laverne.edu. More than happy to engage with your audience. You're always so generous and gracious, Kiko. The thought, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, reductive in many ways and sort of rigid, mechanistic, but also useful because it's so simplistic. Social belonging. As human beings under the theory, we don't want to constantly negotiate our social belongingness. It's threatening to our sense of command and mastery over our conditions and circumstances. We want to move out of it. Social belonging is the highest point of what he called the deficiency needs. Why do I bring this up? At a certain age, it's very threatening to try and engage your social belonging, to renegotiate it, and to encounter language and symbols that you're not familiar with and that are not innate to you from an early age. And this perpetuates okay, to where we are, to me, white fragility. If we grow up under conditions that are so radically separate geographically and engineered, for that matter, to be that way in the country, then what you're going to have is a loathing by whites to engage, as you opened earlier, to be curious, to learn other languages, symbolic, cultural, and otherwise, ways of seeing, knowing, understanding, and to assimilate that. To do that at an early age is not threatening. To know as a human things are really wrong is a struggle after a certain point. And so there's all sorts of ways in which that struggle is accommodated in the breach, to not encourage, to not, right? And I think in some very banal ways, what we're up against is that if we don't progress through the stages of belonging with each other, we're going to do it separately. And you're going to have people, and a very unequal demand on people's time, space, and lives, soul, and psyche, as given account by Toni Morrison and Maya Angelou here, as a result of that. In some ways, it would be very simple if we could ordain that children grow up in the same neighborhoods and go to the same schools and have the opportunities that are right. And then we almost certainly that so much could be solved. We don't, because you follow the money. If you follow the money, you see where it ends up, and we're back to Marx. We're back to the means of production, actually. We're back to surplus value. We're right back to race as epiphenomenal, as an artifact of procuring of capital and a reproduction of capital and the structures of capital. There is a kind of Mobius strip here, back to Marx and back to class and back to capital, quite clearly evident. Mm-hmm. That it requires this racialized contract, this epistemology, is important to understand and fathom. And I am chagrined to say I didn't encounter Mills until a friend and colleague, a dear friend, respected colleague, Jason Needleman at the University of Laverne, said, "Matt, but have you read Mills?" And this was maybe 10 years ago, long after I'd sort of waded into my, right, "Matt, but you've read Mills, right?" "No, I haven't. What do you got?" So he was completely on this 30 years ago and articulated it very well. But Ralph Ellison did it back when he wrote Invisible Man too. He also got with this and understood very well. And his encounters, Ellison got, a big part of Invisible Man is a rebuke based on his experience with the Communist Party of America and his attempt to get with them, not unlike Mills intellectually gets with Marxism. Ellison tried to get with the Communist Party as a young man and saw that as emancipatory and discovered that it wasn't. And maybe in ways like Leo Tolstoy tried to get with the Freemasons and discovered their esoterica was useless to him. And he told that story in War and Peace with his protagonist, Pierre Bezukhov. I'm trying to come full circle here with some stuff that, this stuff's been around for a while, and art and literature and philosophers have articulated it, but the banalities of capital have prevailed to maintain divisions, because follow the money.
Yes, and we will try to connect those two even more the next time we come around. The class race dynamic is always present. It's something that you always have to confront, and there's always, you can feel the friction between the two constantly. And that's not even factoring in other parts of identity and other parts of experiences, whether it's gender or geography even. But we will continue this episode at a later time, probably in April, because we have a lot in the books here at Kiko's Freethinkers Forum. But I just want to urge the audience, subscribe for free. Check out Matthew Witt's works. I'm going to link all of his information in the episode description. I love this episode 105. I still have to learn more about Mills. I'm glad that Dr. Witt introduced me to Charles W. Mills because um, I wish I would have been introduced to him in an early age too, but hey, it's better late than never. And I can't wait to learn more about Charles W. Mills the next episode. And we're gonna, try to learn from each other as well. But beautiful people, enjoy the rest of your day. We got a lot of beautiful guests coming on down the road. And just keep following the forum and you'll see these people and these wonderful perspectives being shared constantly, and hopefully this will spill into the communities at the family level, the neighborhood level, and just your friends, your family. Have these conversations with people, and I feel like it is a learning experience. I learn each time I hear these episodes myself, and that's what I want you to take away from this: is less argument, less division, more conversation, more analytical, more using your brain, and less reaction to things, and actually try to take into consideration what other people are telling you. But regardless, have a wonderful evening, and we will talk soon. Cheers, everybody.
Cheers.